Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the Director of the Fine Art Museums, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today for the first of our two-day symposium, Art and War in the Renaissance, organized around our exhibition, Art and War in the Renaissance, the Battle of Pavia Tapestries. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge, of course, the awful events that are going on in Los Angeles, even as we speak, which are impacting so many of our friends and relations and colleagues, and our hearts and thoughts go out to people who are being directly impacted by these events, especially our colleagues at the Getty Museum and at the Huntington Library and Museum. And of course, our best wishes go to everyone all the first responders and the fire brigades who are tackling this terrible situation. Turning to the events of the day, it's wonderful to see so many people here in the auditorium for this symposium. We're also being joined online, so welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We'll be, over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to hear from 12 speakers, hopefully. First here today at the De Young, and then the second session will be at the Legion of Honor tomorrow. And as we start, I think it's fitting to recall that 48 years ago, in 1976, the then Curator of Textiles at the Fine Art Museums, Anna Bennett, published one of the first major catalogues of a museum tapestry collection in the United States. And it appeared in '76, and the same year she convened a symposium, the proceedings of which were published 3 years later. And I think that was the first international symposium on the subject to be held in America. Over the ensuing years, over the ensuing 48 years, an enormous amount of research has appeared, including very significant books and articles by some of the scholars who took part in that symposium. And I especially want to single out our dear colleague and friend, Professor Dr. Guy Marcel, who contributed to that catalogue and has led the field of tapestry research really ever since. Guy unfortunately cannot be with us today, but I know he's with us online, and I want to say that we're dedicating the events of today to him and to his achievement in the field. There has been an extraordinary amount of research and publication in these years, many major collection catalogues, exhibitions, individual studies, and yet in so many ways the field of tapestry is still kind of catching up with a lot of the rest of art history. Increasingly, I think historians recognize the extraordinary importance of tapestry from the Middle Ages through into the Rococo era, and even in the 19th century during the kind of the arts and crafts movement. And yet, the complexity of studying tapestry, the dispersal of collections, the fact that so many are in storage, the fact that so much material has been published in relatively obscure scholarly articles, means that there is still so much to be done. The digital era has greatly increased accessibility. That's very exciting. But as you'll hear today from our speakers, there is still groundbreaking research being done. So it's an exciting field to be in. And I'm both delighted and honored that some such leading experts have traveled from around the world to be with us for this symposium. Before I start, I just quickly want to thank, of course, this is all taking place because of the exhibition, and I want to thank our colleagues at the Capodimonte Museum in Naples, the former director, Sylvain Bélanger, with whom we first discussed this exhibition project. Curator Carmine Romano, who has been so key in coordinating with our teams. The current director, Eike Schmidt, who has been extremely supportive of it. David Gramazio and his colleagues at Museum Box, who organized the tour. And I also want to thank director Laurence Decay at the Louvre for so generously lending the Bernard van Orley drawings, or Bernard van Orley workshop drawings, relating to these tapestries that we are displaying with the tapestries in what I think is a first. Before we start the proceedings, I want to thank those organizations who have made this symposium possible, because of course it's quite pricey, flying everybody in. The Textile Arts Council of the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco have been extremely generous, as have been the J. Pritzker Foundation. We also have had support from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, the Italian Cultural Institute, Leslie Budge, who's with us this morning, Helena Hermark, Ellen Claw, and Simon Francis, who's also with us this morning. I'd like to thank the amazing staff here who have organized the symposium, many teams and individuals. I want to single out our AV, development, and executive office teams. Our public programs team has done a really extraordinary job in organizing all of this. And I especially want to thank Maria Egoaville and Devin Malone, who is spending their birthday with us today. Over the course of the next 2 days, Jeffrey Freeman and I will alternate MC duties. Jeffrey was the organizing curator of the exhibition, sitting down here at the front. So you'll be seeing a fair amount of Jeffrey too. Our plan is to have each of the papers will be about 25 minutes. We'll have time for a quick 5-minute Q&A before we move on to the next speaker. And then at the end of each session, if time allows, we'll have a slightly more extended Q&A with the speakers of that session coming back onto the stage. So with that, can I ask you all to make sure you've turned off your mobile phones? And it's my pleasure to now introduce our first speaker, Francesca Borgo, who I first met when she was a visiting fellow at the Getty Center about 7 years ago. Francesca is assistant professor in the School of Art History at the University of St. Andrews and the principal investigator of the Lisa Meitner Group, Decay, Loss and Conservation in Art History, at the Bibliotheca Hertziana, which is at the Max Planck Institute for Art History in Rome. Francesca is an art historian of early modern Southern Europe, with a specialization in the art and theory of Renaissance Italy. She has published widely on the intersections between visual, literary, and scientific culture, and on the work of Leonardo da Vinci in particular. And she's interested in the interplay between academic and community knowledge on Leonardo, and supports public engagement through teaching, public lectures, and curatorial work. So with that, Francesca, please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to view the Pavia Tapestry set arranged in this new sequence, first proposed by Cecilia Paredes in 2014, and also to be able for the first time, as you mentioned, to compare the tapestry set with the drawings from the Van Orley workshop for the first time, not just in reproduction, but in person. It really is wonderful. The paper that I will be presenting today examines the set within the framework of contemporary debates on the visual representation of war. Battle images indeed undergo a process of increasing theorization during the early decades of the 16th century, and they turn into objects of intense debate during this time. So my paper does not dwell on the specificity of the tapestry medium, And unlike the majority of the speakers in this symposium, I am not a tapestry expert and a textile specialist. Instead, I aim to place the set in dialogue with contemporary experiments in battle painting and epic poetry. But we are not too far from textility, at least on the metaphorical level, so do not fear. Part of what I will be doing is looking at how the narrative material drawn from chronicles and battle accounts was woven into a storyline by the tapestry set designer Bernard van Orley. But first, let us look at the Battle of Pavia in the company of a cohort of period viewers from 1532. We are among a group of dinner guests invited to view a frescoed hall adorned with battle scenes. The host escorts us by torchlight to a loggia where a sweeping battle cycle unfolds. It depicts 1,000 years of wars waged by foreign armies on Italian soil, beginning with the Visigoth sack of Rome of 410 AD and ending with the descent of King Francis I's French army into Italy and the decisive morning clash outside Pavia on February 24, 1525. Soldiers, horses, standards, uniforms, fallen weapons, battlefield topography, and army formations generate a fully saturated painting field that poses a serious challenge to the group of viewers. All is to be seen in the hall, painted beautifully and colorfully, and yet precisely because it is all, it is also too much, and the viewing requires assistance. So the host explains the scene, emphatically pointing and guiding the gaze of the visitors among the turmoil. And it is only with his help that viewers finally detect the presence of the two Avalos cousin, Fernando Francesco, the imperial commander, and his cousin Alfonso, the Marquis del Vasto, as well as the king, Francis I, in the moment of his capture. We are in the fortress of Tristan from Canto 33 of Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, or The Frenzy of Orlando. So the illustration that you see here is both a mise-en-scene of the protagonist's gaze and also a mise-en-abîme of our gaze, the reader's gaze. Descriptions of battle cycle like these populate chivalric and epic poems of the period. And although fictional, these viewing accounts reveal how contemporaries conceived of this particular type of visual experience and offer extensive testimony about the viewing of battle painting as it was understood at the time. Actual viewing tours where spoken group commentaries formed an essential part of the experience of a painted battle cycle abound. Just to limit myself to Charles V, one could mention his visit to Palazzo Te in Mantua in 1530, the Sala del Consistorio in Siena, which he visited in 1536, and Fontainebleau in 1539. All these visits included prolonged discussions of battle scenes, where the emperor, shepherded by members of the court, enjoyed reading descriptions and hearing explanations of the subjects represented. So this is not the intimate, solitary, and stationary gaze of the studiolo. Looking at battles is a social experience done in motion and in dialogue. These images become meaningful not in a single glance, but through an extended process accompanied by words, by the host's narration and the cycle's inscriptions. Fascinated by the terrible beauty and variety of the scenes, the people in the fortress of Tristan find it impossible to leave the hall. They return 2 and 3 times to see the paintings again and reread many times the golden inscriptions. These, Ariosto tells us, this is the source of battle painting's power, the possibility of extended perusal, the privilege of endless return and commentary. While the viewing initially proceeds chronologically, the order is soon lost. The host's narration obliterates any straightforward chronological sequence. It is interrupted and resumes in different locations, deferring or forestalling the episodes depicted. Linear temporal references are deliberately sabotaged in favor of a more artful arrangement, and the spatial movement of the group in front of the cycle also oscillates back and forth several times. So imagine what this could mean for a highly mobile medium like tapestry, where the order of the scenes itself could be materially rearranged. Beginning in 1520, a substantial critical apparatus emerged, examining the ideal length, unity, and sequence required for depicting war, and gave rise in the following decades, the 1530s, to a fully articulated theory of the epic genre. Theories distinguished two modes of narrative disposition for war: one natural, used by historians, and one artificial, reserved for poets. In the Poetics, Aristotle points out that unlike the historian who deals with all the battles happening in a given chronological frame and does so in chronological order, the epic poet can violate chronology in favor of coherence. Epics must weave its narrative. It must follow a textile logic, if you will. Jérémy Coringue has shown how these discussions informed the battles designed by Raphael's Circle, and above all, the non-chronological development or arrangement of the whole of Troy in Mantua's ducal palace, painted in 1536 by one of the foremost pupil of Raphael, Giulio Romano, a name that you'll hear me repeat again. But the epic plot must avoid stretching beyond certain limits. Its entirety should remain viewable in one glance. Thinking about the plot as to something with a spatial rather than temporal dimension, Aristotle imagines the reader as a surveyor, viewing the poem as a panorama with clearly articulated endpoints, and writes that, I cite, it must be possible for the beginning and end of the work to be taken in one view. Ariosto's poem famously did not respect these directions. The illustrations were especially controversial for the use of continuous narrative. Against an increasingly restrictive view of painting as a medium confined to depicting a single action, battle painting, however, continued to merge multiple temporal moments into a single image by spreading different narrative episodes across the pictorial field. So the neat distinction articulated by contemporary artistic theory between figural foreground, the so-called piano, and the non-narrative, non-figural ground, the campo, does not hold true for battle painting as it does for virtually every other pictorial genre in this period. War scenes defy the traditional notion of the campo, which is a word both for pictorial field and battlefield. They defy the notion of the campo as a space for backdrop elements, casamenti or landscape that creates depth around the figure and make them stand out more clearly. In battle painting, the campo is entirely conquered by figural presence. The narrative action extends up until the horizon line, and the visibility of each body interferes with that of adjacent ones. This figurative overflow is both a compositional threat and a defining feature of epic grandeur. It invites the painter to renegotiate and reinvent the campo and the whole of it as a legitimate space for the unfolding of the narrative. We are all aware of how much battle's intricacy and visual complexity become much harder to untangle when executed in the medium of tapestry. And it is an interesting curatorial exercise, I think, to consider how much today's visitors are inclined to scan the Pavia battlefield and how much the verbal dimension, both spoken and written, still plays a crucial part in the experience of the image. Regretfully, I do not have a new 16th century account describing how period viewers looked at the Battle of Pavia that I can offer today, although I promise I will keep looking for it. But there's still a bit that we can do with what is available. We know the tapestry set was exhibited at least 3 times in public occasions. For its presentation to Charles in the Brussels Royal Palace in March 1531, in August 1549 at Mary of Hungary's residence in Binge for the joyous entry of Crown Prince Philip in the Low Countries, and then finally 7 years later in February 1556 again in Brussels Royal Palace for the signing of a peace treaty with France when it nearly caused a diplomatic incident. Because of the wealth of sources available, the Binge 1549 display is the most promising place to look. We know in this occasion the tapestries were spread over 2 rooms in Philip's apartments, a large antechamber which served as the prince's dining room, and a smaller bedchamber, so much for the relevance of chronology and linear narrative. But this set is not intended as a chronicle of the battle. As the current sequence of display shows, and as Cecilia Paredes first argued, the disposition of the narrative material is not linear. There are visible discrepancies between the order of events and that in which they are presented, and such anachronisms would not have seemed absurd to period beholders, and they're very much in keeping with ongoing discussions. Multiple sequential narrative episodes are condensed within each scene, spread across the pictorial field, again in keeping with tradition for this genre. Although I have to admit that unlike some of you, I have some reservations in recognizing the same figure being depicted multiple times, and I'm under the impression Van Orley avoids this as much as possible. One example is this one that you see here, where Francis I is shown allegedly twice, riding in the foreground, attempting to escape with others, and then right at the center of the middle foreground, Ezechiel's Ferrante castrata, the Marquis of Civita Sant'Angelo, whose name is, ironically, embroidered on the reins of his mount. Ironically, because in Spanish sources, the Marquis was said to have forgotten to reinforce his reins with chains. So these were cut off very early on in the battle. He lost control of his horse, and he found himself in the path of Francis I, who killed him with a spear. And he's the only imperial commander to fall on the Pavia battlefield. Italian sources instead attribute his death, also similarly attribute his death to an oversight. He's found on the battlefield days later, after the battle is over, with a gash in the face for, they say, having forgotten to put down the visor during a charge. Admittedly, is it only thanks to the inscription on Castrata's reins if we are able to identify this vignette? A Spanish courtier, Vicente Alvarez, who saw the tapestries on display in the Binch Palace in 1549, indicated that, I cite, in English translation, you have the original Spanish on the screen, all the captains and distinguished personalities are marked with written labels, all except the Spaniards, sarcastically adding that they must have been asleep. Like in the Ariosto passage, in his viewing too, Alvarez focuses on the presence of distinguished protagonists tagged by inscriptions. 15 are still visible today, either woven, embroidered, or written in ink, which is in itself highly significant, I think, because it means that the presence of distinguished, of important military leaders was still very much felt, so the need to make the presence of them visible and or it also to attach to a figure a new identity was still very much alive. Being present and visible is what mattered, and the recognizability of commanders within the battle is a fraught issue, both in pictorial and military treatises of the time. According to Baldassare Castiglione in The Courtier, a kind of a manual book for behavior of the courtier court, the soldiers and in general people involved in battles should try to detach themselves from the confusion and go fight in a space where their presence can be more visible, because they're the only ones in that area, and so they must attract the eyes of the commander like a magnet. While the ink inscriptions are superimposed incongruously onto the pictorial space, the woven and embroidered names always belong to the figuration, as if inscribed on the blades of swords 4 times, on the plates of armor twice, or embroidered on the horse harness 7 times. So, and they are often the only recourse available to viewers to single out a particular narrative vignette from the expansive composition, or better, to distinguish them as descriptive of a particular event of the battle, a particular exploit, rather than just generic accidents of action. Within these spacious and deep landscapes, the viewer encounters a variety of scattered accidents, each one with its own temporal resonance. Stretching the space the bodies can inhabit towards the upper margin of the picture, this view grants to the painter more room, or in this case, to the tapestry, more room to fit the battle's complex and crowded action. The needs of rhetorical decorum demanded a forceful representation able to convey the confusion of the struggle while, at the same time, imposing on it a coherent form to avoid letting the chaos inherent in the subject throw the composition itself into disarray. That in battle scenes the horizon line should almost coincide with the upper margin of the picture was first recommended by Gauricus, an Italian art theorist, in 1504, to avoid having the figures in the foreground obstruct the visibility of those immediately behind. This is the view from above that we normally associate with battle painting, a view that, by 1550s, had supplanted earlier frieze-like battle compositions, and that by 1570s had already started to stretch into cartographic projections, where the background sort of dissolves into a map. The unity of action in the set is secured not temporally, but rather spatially, topographically, by the boundedness of the battlefield. The decision to make space rather than time the ordering and unifying principle was certainly facilitated, if not prompted, by a natural feature of the battlefield outside Pavia, which was conveniently framed, almost as a stage, by the walls of the Barco, the old Visconti hunting grounds, and the course of the Ticino River. This is a feature of the Pavia battleground that did not escape the attention of contemporaries. The broadsheets and engravings produced in the immediate aftermath of the battle, and I think I managed to gather all of them here on the screen, clearly highlight this feature of the battlefield topography, which almost lends a diagrammatic quality to them. You see the walls, trying to see if I can, yeah. So you see the walls of the Barco, delimiting the battlefield, the course of the Ticino River, and then these concentric circles that you see around the city are the trenches excavated by the French soldier during the siege. It is upon breaching the wall of the Barco that the imperial army enters the stage and, simplifying, drives the French from the northeast side to the southwest and over the Ticino River. I should also add that all the painted and engraved views are invariably seen from the point of view of the two armies. We will never know how the battlefield looked like seen from the besieged city, seen from Pavia. We don't have a single image of the battle seen from the city, which I think it's in itself highly significant. So we are looking always from north to south, and the south is at the top of the image here. Van Orley took advantage of the spatial boundedness of the action by giving us two clearly articulated endpoints, the beginning and end of the Pavia narrative graspable in one view. The cycle begins with the breach into the Barco wall, through which the imperial army entered the scene, and ends with the exeunt of the French rear guard over the Ticino River. For the skepticals among you, here lies a good indication that the temporality of the narrative is being actively manipulated. We see the breach of the Barco wall that sets the action in motion, but significantly, we do not see it in the moment of its breaching, the very first hours of the day, or not even when the imperial army is first crossing it, but instead much later in the day, almost towards the end of the battle, when it is the imperial baggage train and the civilians that are approaching it. And this detail evokes the temporal resonance, the span of duration of the entire action. When arranged in this order, typological correspondences between episodes also emerge. Chronological disjuncture among flanking episodes are counterbalanced by thematic echoes connecting opposing ones. The insertion of genre-like details in two scenes where the baggage trains are visible, but in a chiasmic direction. The imperial one enters the field, the French one evacuates the field. The two scenes where the architectural features of the landscape dominate instead are the setting of two particularly humiliating moments for the French. They're hiding, sources say, like moles inside the circular trenches that they excavated, and of course the capture of the king. Let me add that this is not the turning point of the narrative, but rather a farther, although crucial, step in validating the French defeat. Indeed, starting from the central cavalry engagement, from which the action appears to unfold in two opposite directions, the foregrounds of all the other tapestries display a rising tide of French defeats, Towards the left, the king and his entourage are leaving the battlefield, then the king's capture, then the desertion of the Swiss. And then in the other direction, the flight of the civilians, the drowning of soldiers into the river, and the retreat of the rear guard. So we have in the center the only scene where fighting really occurs and extends with minor spillages on either sides onto the third and fifth tapestries on the side of this one. Everywhere else, there is a lot of movement, of course, but with the exception of very circumscribed vignettes, soldiers pass each other on parallel planes on the field, almost like ships that pass in the night. This is the only scene where the two armies are meeting head-on, and the fighting extends across the image. The pictorial field, in this case, entirely coincides with the battlefield. Van Orley's compositional efforts to single out the two army generals is particularly evident here. And you see them here, sort of like depicted in a slightly larger scale than the soldiers around them, and in a very distinct sort of hieratic poses. I also think that the horizontal horizontal and vertical axis of the weapons that they are holding also helps kind of singling them out as a compositional device. And I should also probably add that the insertion of portraits of commander in battlefields was singled out already by Pliny in the Naturalis Historia as one of the biggest advancement in the art of painting. The brother of Phidias, Paneus, is the first one who manages to effectively insert the portraits of 5 commanders in his depiction of the Battle of Marathon, and does so not with the recursive inscriptions, but purely through formal means, with how the generals are portrayed. So in this scene is where it would seem to make the most sense to look for well-established figural citations extracted from battle scenes by Raphael and his pupils, an exercise I was invited to undertake for this occasion, and I diligently complied and spent a long time looking at all the little soldiers in the far background. Raphael's battles were mined by contemporaries as a stockpile of battle motifs. The characteristic formulaic density, people have said, of battle scenes refers precisely to this practice of extracting closely involved figural groups from prominent examples and then insert them into new compositions. Raphael's battles were praised for many accomplishments. Historical accuracy, he copied the portraits of the general from Roman coins. The topography of the battlefield around the Milvian Bridge is also accurate. The depiction of weapons, uniforms, everything complies and is historically accurate. Scale and size of the figure, the composition, which manages to reconcile the scale of martial operations with the portrait of the most eminent participants and their individual performance, the individual heroic gesture, and the collective act. But they were especially praised for the inclusion of what Rudolf Primesberger has called icons of pathos, figural motifs that are not descriptive of a particular event, but exemplary of the passion they represent, serving as a synecdoche for the anonymous multitudes in the background. And so they act as a foil to the main action, enriching the narrative. I've highlighted 3 of them here, but there's many like this. A particularly prominent example is the older bearded man that supports the dead body of a younger soldier, often interpreted as a father and son group. The soldier was fallen from his mount, and the lifeless corpses abandoned head down along the foreground. They're whole rhetorically charged details. As embodiment of emotional states, they chart the full sweep of the action: pain, fear, fierceness, compassion, resistance, puzzlement, and determination are all exemplified. The battles designed by Raphael and his circle would have been accessible to Van Orley via one of Raphael's collaborators, Tommaso Vincitor, who was dispatched from Rome to Brussels in 1520 to oversee the completion of 2 sets of tapestry cartoons for Leo X, and stayed for at least 1 year, most likely also returning in 1523. Vincitor would have been the perfect source for learning about the Battle of Constantine in the Vatican, painted between 1521 and 1523, as well as the tapestry series with the feats of Scipio, whose design must have been conceived by Giulio Romano before his move to Mantua in 1525, so well before the set was actually woven. Here you see only the battle scenes from the deeds, and for legibility purposes, here they are in a later print translation. As Tom Campbell pointed out, evidence that Van Orley had seen at least one of the feast designs by 1524 is provided by a citation of the capture of Carthage in a modello dated to that year that you see here. And it's an obvious citation. So it would only make sense that when tasked to depict the Battle of Pavia sometime around 1528, Van Orley would turn once again to the battle scenes designed by Raphael's school. And the Pavia narrative provided many opportunities to do so. And yet Van Orley seems to resist the temptation of a literal citation. So the bodies of the enemies drowning in the river, for example, that you see here, a comparison between Raphael's fresco and the tapestry. Or, of course, the figure of the commander on horseback. And again, and I think it's really telling that you resist the temptation to cite this figure here, given the opportunity that he had to depict a figure of the defeated enemy on horse. You see here, and you see it here in the far right, adapted as the figure of Scipio in a later cartoon, The Combat of the Ticinus. So very effectively re-employed, extracted from its source and readapted, inserted into a new battle composition. Although perhaps he borrows more inconspicuously, though, from Giulio for a figure in the far background of the final scene, and I hope you can see it, it's right here. Even the very famous head hunter, so-called head hunter motif that you see here again in Raphael's original fresco and then in one of Giulio's designs that appears everywhere in battle scenes, in Italian battle scenes from the period. Even that motif is missing. It's a motif that actually goes back to Roman sarcophagi. And most of the two-figure combat groups that you see are gathered, almost all of them, I think, in this slide, either on horse or on foot, follow the instructions of contemporary combat manuals and target the throat of the enemy. And finally, the closely intertwined symplegma, so the intertwined bodies of two soldiers lying on each other on the ground. This is also in Leonardo's Fight for the Standard, again that you see in the two designs by Giulio, is varied in the tapestry, always with one figure facing away and towards the ground. And this is especially striking for me, as I do not recall seeing a similar motif in the Italian battle scenes that I usually work on. It's very rare for a soldier to be attacked from behind. And I think it's significant that so many of these are included here. So I started wondering, and again, it's a proposal, and I'm looking forward to your feedback, and I'll go back to this idea with more time. I wonder if Fechtbücher, or contemporary German and Flemish combat manuals that were especially popular in the 1520s and 30s. You see here one commissioned by the Augsburg merchant Paulus Hector Meyer and illustrated by Jörg Breu, that might have, if these kind of sources, visual sources, might have played a part in providing Van Orley with historically accurate and updated formulas for the engagement of soldiers, equipped with alabards and daggers, and this is another big difference, without shields. All of the battle scenes by Raphael and Giulio Romano, the soldiers are always holding shields to defend themselves. In many of the figures in the Van Orley tapestry, sometimes I have the feeling that one hand is raised and the object that that hand is supposed to be holding is actually missing. So I am not proposing a system of direct citations here, But if the overall, and I have other examples taken from Factbooker, you see that they have this insistence about aiming at the throat of the enemy as a kind of like a safe target for different kinds of weapons. And this is also the only occasion where I do see fighters being attacked from behind. So if the overall composition, as I hope I have shown, is in keeping with the compositional experiments unfolding south of the Alps, at the level of the individual figural motifs, the tapestry is not as close as we would expect it to be. Or perhaps Van Orley, like Raphael's, is following the diktat of historical accuracy. These are, like Raphael's, these are soldiers fighting for an emperor, but 1,000 years have passed since the exploits at the Milvian Bridge, a millennium of wars fought on Italian soil. So we are still those viewers in the fortress of Tristan. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If anyone would like a comment or question, I'm very happy to take them.
Well, maybe if the audience is still warming up, Francesca, that amazing talk. Thank you very much.
May I ask
you raise a whole range, I think, of really interesting issues that we can explore further in the next couple of days.
May I ask a question?
Oh, yes, sorry, absolutely.
Pardon me. Concerning the gentleman who's in the center of the three horses, where Francis has been, his horse has been killed underneath him and he's being held. And Mr. Campbell, I know in the notes for the exhibit, it suggests that it's Charles of Brabant who is the man with the cross on him. But I know that Henry III of Nassau had commissioned a tapestry series, or I believe a tapestry series from Van Orley earlier, and to celebrate the Nassau family. And it seems to me that that gentleman might be Henry III, who was his chamberlain. Is there any possibility of that? Thank you.
I mean, there are many different versions of what actually happens when Francis I is captured. And of course, everybody wants to be present in that moment and wants to be close to the king, right? So depending on the sources that we're consulting, German, Spanish, not many Italian sources that describe the episode, only letters to ambassadors in the days following the battle. You do have a different set of names. Now, what's important, I think, and interesting about this episode is that there's actually a kind of like a sort of like a material legacy to it, in that several objects of Francis are taken as loot by the soldiers that first approach him on the battlefield. And these are the sword, I think, a part of the pennant, and then a book of hours that is carrying with them. Some of these are still traceable. The sword that is taken on the battlefield by a Spanish nobleman is actually then enters the Spanish royal collection. It's exhibited at the Palacio Real in Madrid for decades, up until the 19th century, when Napoleon requested it back. So right now, if you want to see that sword, is on display at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. But it's a relatively modern location, right? Because for all of early modernity, it was part of the Spanish royal collection. This is all to say that who is depicted around the king is a highly, in that specific moment, is a highly fraught issue. And there are inscriptions, there are many inscriptions that identify the figures on the sword. And inscriptions are usually focused either on the scene of the kind of like the climax of the action that I've shown that I lingered on for so long, or around here. So there's one here, and another one here. Now, I know Cecilia knows, and probably Tom also know more than me about, I don't think these are the added on written inscription. These are original, right, to the weaving of the set, and they should be embroidered. So we should probably go with the identification that they are providing, and thinking that those are the soldiers that were originally meant to be depicted as surrounding Francis in this highly significant moment for the kind of chivalric code of the time. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add. Yeah.
No, I think this is the question of who the figure in the center is continues to be something we want to figure out. It has been suggested that it's Charles de Bourbon, but Charles de Bourbon is actually very clearly portrayed here with the same insignia in which he appears in the tapestry where the Habsburg troops are emerging from the forest. So the figure in black in the center certainly is not him. It's interesting that he has no inscription, but I think this is unquestionably something that can, he's clearly such a central figure, looking out at the audience in such a prominent position, right in the center. Whether this is the central tapestry or not, it's clearly something that's to be resolved. Well, so Francesca, any other questions? We're going to have an opportunity for the speakers to come back at the end of the morning. Any other burning questions in this moment?
I have one.
Sir.
How broad an audience was it at these first three? You mentioned three different initial presentations. It must have been grand presentations. How broad an audience were there for those viewers?
We do have actually a depiction of the main hall of the Brussels Royal Palace during the festivities of the Binch Grey Hall during the festivities for Philip II. I did not include it in the PowerPoint. This is not the room where the tapestries were on display, but it gives you a sense of the kind of the scale of the gathering. Absolutely, large groups of people. It's also interesting that this Spanish nobleman, whose citation I brought, evidently has access to the apartments of the Prince of Philip. So these are also spaces, what we would perhaps nowadays conceive as a private space, had very different rules of access back then. So yeah, and I think very much the experience of looking at them, it's something that is done in group and in conversation. And it's beautiful to see how this is a trait of tapestry looking that is still very much present today. We are naturally invited, naturally sort of inclined to talk about what we're seeing, precisely because what we're seeing is so complex, and it's clear that it requires time to be untangled.
Francesca, thank you for really a very thought-provoking presentation. And when we so often think of Northern artists, drawing inspiration from Italian artists, sometimes even rather slavishly, fascinating that you very clearly show that Van Orley is, as with his use of Jura prints, really looking very widely. It really just brings attention back to what a great storyteller he was, and how there's more to be unpacked in that. So with that, let's turn to our second speaker, Elizabeth Cleland. Elizabeth is a curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where she's responsible for post-medieval European textiles. Working at the Met since 2004, she curated Relative Values, where she played an important part, and also with research with Renaissance tapestries back in early 2000s. Curated Relative Values, the Cost of Art in the Northern Renaissance. co-curated Grand Design, Pieter Coecke van Aelst and Renaissance Tapestry in 2014-15, and the Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England, which some of you will have seen when it toured to San Francisco a year and a half ago. Elizabeth was the principal author of Grand Design's award-winning catalogue. She co-edited Tapestry in the Baroque, New Aspects of Production and Patronage, which was the proceedings of a conference we had at the Met and was published in 2010. And she co-authored Tapestries from the Burrell Collection, which was published in 2017, and Renaissance Splendor, Catherine de' Medici's Valois Tapestries in 2018, and the Tudors catalogue in 2022. Before moving to New York, she studied at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, receiving her MA and PhDs from the Courtauld. So with that, Lizzie, thank you.
Oh, thanks very much for that very kind introduction, Tom. And I'm just going to close this PowerPoint and open my own. There we go. Excellent. So good morning, everyone. I am thrilled and honored to be here with such a lineup of speakers. And I think I'll continue the accolades you're going to hear throughout the day to congratulate you here in San Francisco, Tom Campbell, Jeff Raymond, for the fantastic exhibition you have upstairs. And not just the tapestries, but also the coup of being able to borrow the drawings as well and to have them shown side by side only here in San Francisco. And I think I'm not talking out of school to say that I'm actually pretty envious that I can't also share this with East Coast audiences. So it's fantastic. Thank you. So right now, upstairs in this museum, we can experience one of the most exciting tapestry series produced during the early modern age, the Renaissance. As the labels, catalogue, and other didactics remind us, this series of 7 tapestries commemorates a decisive victory on the part of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V against his French counterpart François Ier, as we've heard from Francesca's fantastic talk just now, fought out during one decisive day, the 24th of February, 1525, around the town of Pavia in Lombardy, on the Italian peninsula, and at that time part of the Duchy of Milan. Standing in the room, enveloped by the tapestries, the viewer feels transported back to the grit and the noise of the muddy battlefield, the pounding of the horses' hooves, the clash of metal, the grunting and the shouting, the smells. And as we've heard, I'm sure you'll agree, as Belgian scholar Cecilia Paradès proved to us in her groundbreaking article 11 years ago, this feeling of really being there is no accident. Enveloped in a room in a particular sequence, and we can experience part of that for ourselves upstairs in the main gallery. The setting is a continuous panorama, foreshadowing cinematic surround sound by 4.5 centuries. The background landscape is continuous across the 7 tapestries, but so is the foreground. So we can really see that. You've got the wall, which you can see continuing through the 2. We have the river, which flows between tapestries. And we even have the direction of protagonists' gazes and gestures linking one tapestry to the next. And you can see this upstairs to great effect. So this chap looks across here, and these girls, this lady, actually points over to the men over here. It's really incredible. So what was the context for this extraordinarily innovative project? We know that the States General of the Low Countries presented the tapestries to Charles V when he visited Brussels in 1531. In the later case of the magistrate of the city of Antwerp's gift to visiting Spaniard Archduke Albrecht in 1597, they emulated the canny idea of giving a tapestry series commemorating his military triumph. But in that case, posterity is blessed with an abundance of documents. I'm showing you one of these battles of Archduke Albrecht tapestries here. We know that the series was commissioned By whom? We know it was contracted to the designer Otto von Veen. We know who the cartoon painter was, Hans Snellink. We know who the weaver was, Martin Remarts the Younger. We know the compensation they received, the circumstances of the presentation, and so forth. We're lacking that paper trail in the case of Brussels' Pavia gift, and it's not even certain that the States General hatched the idea in the first place. Perhaps, like their late 15th century predecessors in Bruges, when they were seeking to mollify Charles's great-grandfather and namesake, Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy, they took advantage of a project already underway, gratefully appropriating the tapestries as their gift to their overlord, and that's the story of Troy that you can see here. Just as Charles's aunt, Margaret of Austria, governor of the Netherlands, probably commissioned this earlier series, Los Honores, as a gift to celebrate Charles's election to Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, Brussels-based might she also have been the instigator of the Pavia series. Her role has been lost in the midst of time since she died in December 1530, only 3 months before Charles's visit. Conceivably, her niece and successor, Mary of Hungary, arriving in Brussels to take up the post of governor of the Netherlands in 1531, would oversee the completion of the Pavia Tapestry series that had been offered to Charles V at the March festivities. In her Aunt Margaret's footsteps, Mary would go on to mastermind a plethora of great tapestry series, supporting a great generator of the Netherlands' economy. So we've got the story of Troy, the story of St. Paul, that's here, yeah. Or the Poesia, the conquest of Tunis. Certainly, it was with Mary that the Pavia tapestries remained when Charles decided not to take the tapestries back to Spain with him, which is, I think you'll agree, an extraordinary decision, until we remember that the French scholar Jean-Marie Le Gall reminded us of Luther's statement that the scrupulous Holy Roman Emperor felt he shouldn't display tapestries in which he seemed to take pleasure in another Christian king's downfall. And of course, there we see that ignominious episode. As those who've read the catalogue will recall, the Pavia tapestries were part of Mary's estate and not that of the Spanish crown. Setting aside the question of Margaret and Mary's roles for future investigation, posterity agrees that it was their court painter, the celebrated Brussels-based artist Bernard van Orley, who designed the Battle of Pavia. It is Bernard van Orley whose name is rightly always celebrated as the artist of these tapestries. But at the risk of preaching to the choir with this audience, I do think it's worth remembering that tapestries are not paintings. They're not big panels, they're not frescoes. Tapestries were unique amongst early modern artistic production, and not just in terms of their value and prestige. And by now, I think everyone here is familiar with quite how astronomically expensive these tapestries were. But also in terms of production process. Tapestry combines many phases and the cooperation of multiple craftspeople between the design stage and the finished weaving, each contribution affecting the ultimate appearance and artistic success of the finished product. The prime artist was the designer, in this instance identified as Bernard van Orley, who conceived the complete project, designing the compositions and deciding narrative breakdown between a set of hangings. In the group of drawings also here in San Francisco, lent by the Louvre, we have a fantastic survival because it provides to us what I believe to be the final preliminary drawings, the petit patron or the patronen of the Pavia series. Having honed his ideas in since lost sketches, Van Orley set his workshop to record the same small drawing scale in the finished drawing designs, which would be given to the actual full-scale models, the cartoons based on them. Already here in these petits patrons, I posit, we see more than just Van Orley's hand, consigning part of this copying work to at least one trusted assistant. I see two distinct hands here, so the foreground and the background, for example. I don't know if you agree. Oh, actually, we'll stick with this one. As a successful artist and trusted court painter, Van Orley's workshop was a well-honed machine, with the master painting portraits and narratives on panels in the conventional, time-consuming, and much-admired oil glaze technique, in addition to providing drawn designs for a multitude of different media, including not only tapestry, but also stained glass. It's worth remembering that the word patron applied to a preliminary drawing for work in any medium, tapestry, stained glass, architecture, goldsmith's work. Van Orley's assistants will have been well-practiced recording the master's designs in patronen. Sometimes Van Orley would subcontract the creation of the actual work of art to an expert, like a stained glass window maker, and then he would be the one to deliver the finished work to the patron. In other instances, though, the petit patron, the small design, completed Van Orley's contribution to a non-painted art project. In other words, that was it. Completing and providing the small design was the full and sum total of Van Orley's role in a project. Documented tapestry projects abound with references to named artists designing the tapestries, Jean Bulldove, Robert Campin, Jacques Daré, Raphael, even Leonardo da Vinci. But almost always it was a different artist who took on the second stage in the production process, the painting of the cartoons, in Dutch patronen in 't groot, as opposed to patronen in 't kleine, and that's from 1542. There are numerous documented instances of one artist paid for the small design and someone from a different workshop painting the cartoons. Thus, we have Meester Jan van Brussel, Master Jan van Brussel of Brussels, handing over his designs to Philips den Schilder, or Philip the painter, Jacques le Peintre to Simon l'Enlumineur, Otto van Veen to Hans Snellink, and so on and so forth. It's not surprising, given that cartoon painting required a distinctive set of skills. This tiny fragment, which was an inspired discovery by Sarah Mallory only 10 years ago, is all we have known to survive from the Pavia cartoons. But it's a lovely survival. So cartoons, you've got to imagine from this tiny fragment, were massive paintings, the same size as the intended tapestries, to be copied line for line by the weavers. Working tools, they needed to be light, portable, and pliable enough to be temporarily attached to the looms. Painted, therefore, on multiple sheets of paper pasted together, which was more readily available thanks to the nascent printing industry. Painting on paper, as on cloth in the preceding century, cartoon painting required proficiency in an entirely different medium to oil glazes on panel, distemper, egg or lime bound, something like de grote doeken met grote beelden, die waren van eiwerve of lijmwerve gedaan, or to translate, big cloths with big pictures done in egg or lime paint, described in 1604 by the Dutch artist-scholar Karel van Mander. Indeed, in Bruges, painting with distemper was considered such a distinctive technique from oil glazing that it even merited its own guild. And it's not simply technical knowledge that singled out tapestry cartoon painting. Translating a tiny monochrome drawing into a full-scale tapestry-sized model for the weaver's guide demanded proficiency in a particular set of artistic conventions. And there you can just hopefully make out, of course, our girl with the little dog, the fragment we have. What worked well in a small panel painting might not translate so well into a massive hanging of knotted and woven threads. Conversely, wall-spanning tapestries unlocked the possibility to play with space in a way pretty much inconceivable on panel. The extension of illusionary dimensions with borders projecting into our space and life-size protagonists locking eyes with us, gazing out from settings whose distant landscapes seem to recede deep beyond the actual wall on which they're hanging. At their best, as upstairs, tapestry designs could pull their viewers into whole other worlds. Not surprisingly, there were artists who chose to specialize in this field. Already in 1504, the poet Jean Lemaire de Belge specified the painter Baudouin de Bayeux as celle faisant patron, the one making cartoons. Thanks to scholars like Edmond Roybart, Joseph Duverger, Marguerite Coecke, and Guy Marcel, a breadcrumb trail of documentary record reveals that this profession had a name. In 1528, Hieronymus van den Couteren was called a schilder of patroonwerker, a painter or a cartoon maker. Jacob de Kempenaar of Brussels was described as patroonschilder, cartoon painter, at his death in 1535, and more familiar to tapestry historians, Leonard Knoest was specifically singled out as patroonschilder van Brussel, a cartoon painter from Brussels, when he joined the Antwerp Painters Guild as a free master in 1544. So, bringing this production context to the front of our minds, it's perhaps not so surprising that the many tapestry projects we know of attributed to Bernard van Orley in fact exhibit a disjointedness of multiple different artistic personalities, some more skilled than others, and some more innovative. The difference between tapestry series like the Ages of Man, which you can see on the left, and the Battle of Pavia, although both overall designs are attributed to Van Orley. Or again, between Van Orley's Legend of Our Lady of Zavel on the left and the Hunts of Maximilian on the right. Or even within one series, Los Honores being a case in point, and so these are details from Justice on the left and Infamy on the right. These differences cannot simply be dismissed as one artist's development matured with age and experience. Instead, I posit they reflect the varying contributions of different cartoon painters interpreting Van Orley's preliminary designs. It's not necessarily that Van Orley couldn't paint Patroon in het Groot. After all, Karel van Mander credits him with being skilled in both watercolour as in oil, but rather, given his workload and success as a portrait and panel painter, he chose not to include the distinctive artistic convention of tapestry cartoon painting in his personal portfolio. We know that he drew the line at creating landscape settings, apparently handing over to his father's brother-in-law, Jan Tons the Elder, for those aspects. I suggest Van Orley's workshop might not even have accommodated the spatial demands required to execute these enormous paintings on paper, either instead subcontracting cartoon painting out to specialized workshops, or even leaving that step in the tapestry production process entirely within the remit of the master weaver. With the handover of the Petit Patron, the Louvre drawings in the case of the Pavia series, the conclusion of Van Orley's workshop's role in the tapestry project. Certainly, documents abound with other instances of master weavers as the entrepreneurs, commissioning, obtaining, retaining, renting out, and reusing their own stock of cartoons. So, returning to the Battle of Pavia, if the Louvre drawings represent the full extent of Van Orley's role conceiving this series, who was it who elevated the project from a proficient record of one skirmish after another to the thrilling and all-enveloping showstopper upstairs? I'm not talking about the necessary conventions of detailing and embellishment of clothing and dress and foliage that the increased scale demanded between a Petit Patron and the Patroon in het Groot. I mean the artistic nuances that elevate the visual and psychological impact of the designs. The differences are relatively minor, and again, if you go upstairs, you can see many of them for yourselves. But here, for example, the angle of the horse's progress tensed in the tapestry to launch out of the hanging and into our space. And you can really see that in the way the shadows are cast in the tapestry from our light source, not so in the drawing. Or the depth of the foreground. In the tapestry, as you can see here, it's brought disconcertingly closer to our space. Or going back again to the girl with the dog, the direction of a gaze. whether it be the girl whose calm resolve in the tapestry locks eyes with the viewer. You can really see that. She looks out at you. In the drawing, she doesn't. Whereas her dog in the tapestry is distracted by the action ahead of them. In the drawing, he looks right at us. But this, what we see in the woven version, works so much better. And another compelling detail, I hope you'll agree, is this one, the placement of the foot. In the tapestry, it's snagging the trailing banner, the edge of the banner we can see here. In the drawing, not so. They're quite separate. They're relatively minor differences, but when you take them together, they make the difference, creating an intentional claustrophobia, disconcertingly real and immediate action, which seems ready to spill out into the viewer's space. So I would say the clue to the identity of Van Orley's cartoon-making collaborator can also be found in Karel van Mander's schilderboek, which we have here. So, what have we got? Leven van Pieter Coecke, schilder en bouwmeester van Aelst. The life of Pieter Coecke, painter and architecture van Aelst. And I've got it on a tiny on the screen here, but around here we have the text where Van Mander says he heeft de kunst gelernt bij Bernard van Brussel. So he learned art from Bernard of Brussels. Hij is een kloek tekenaar en schilder geworden, beiden in olie en waterwerven, so he became a handy draftsman and painter, both in oil and watercolor. En ook in patronen tekenen en schilderen zeer uitnemende, also very exceptional in the drawing and painting of cartoons. Writing in the 1660s, André Philibien repeated that Pieter Coecke was un autre des élèves de Bernard van Orley, so another of Bernard van Orley's pupils, alongside Tons, according to Philibien. Contrary to Van Mander and Philibien, Marion Ainsworth, my colleague back at the Met, has shown that Pieter Coecke probably learned the craft of painting in oil glazes on panel from his father-in-law, the Antwerp-based painter Jan Mersens van Doornicke. So he can't simply have been Van Orley's workshop assistant or apprentice, certainly not when the Pavia Tapestries were being designed. By 1529, Coecke's own Antwerp workshop was up and running, and he himself was taking on apprentices. Instead, might Coecke's early association with Van Orley have been that of subcontract cartoon supplier, painting cartoons after Van Orley's preliminary designs. Coecke was certainly as at home with the technique of tapestry cartoon painting in distemper on paper as he was as a tapestry cartoon painter, because he was a tapestry cartoon painter. In 1541, he was expressly described as een schilder en de patroonmaker, a painter and maker of cartoons. Above all, close looking at other tapestry series securely documented to Pieter Coecke reveals the same inspired artistic personality, whether it's the distinctive faces, and we've got here detail from Pavia on the left and Coecke's Life of St. Paul on the right. Again, Pavia on the left, Coecke's Seven Deadly Sins on the right, and in fact, this fellow might even be a disguised self-portrait. This is Lampsonia's print portrait of Pieter Coecke himself. Echoing poses, and even the gory details, and we've already seen some of these from Francesca, sorry, more, but the gory details of limbs crushed under wheels and severed limbs scattered across battlefields. And even that same daring compositional tricks propelling the tapestry's protagonists, be they horses in the case of Pavia or burning books in the case of Coecke's St. Paul series, propelled relentlessly forward on a trajectory to launch into the viewer's space. If, as I believe, Pieter Coecke supplied the cartoons for the Battle of Pavia, it was around the same time that he designed and painted his first tapestry cartoon series under his own workshop banner in Antwerp, this Life of St. Paul, taking the unusual step to sign one of his petit patrons with his full name. You can see it down here. This drawing's in Vienna. And this astonishing and rare survival is one of Pieter Coecke's full-size cartoons for the St. Paul series. Above all, it's in Coecke's tapestries, and not those associated with Van Orley, that we find other instances of that extraordinary enveloping panoramic landscape, sweeping up the viewer into the tapestry space, whether it be in a procession, enveloping the viewer as they stand in a room hung with Coecke's 7 deadly sins, and here you've got pride and lust, or the shallow foreground pergola-like space shared and continued between the tapestries in the Vertumnus and Pomona series, transporting the viewer of Coecke's series into Goddess Pomona's fantastical garden. Hope you can make that out again here. Or never woven but posthumously printed by his wife, the printmaker Megan Verhulst, the real landscapes of Turkey, which seamlessly flow from one scene into the other beyond caryatid piers. And again, you can see the landscape complete and continuing very neatly across the different scenes. Hailing, as his name suggests, from the small town of Aelst, Coecke initially chose to settle in Antwerp in Flanders, in the 1520s, a modern, prosperous, bustling port and centre of panel painting innovation and trade. But it was Brussels in Brabant where the most exclusive tapestry production and market was based, and Coecke soon seems to have worked up a network travelling the 30 miles between the two counties, collaborating as a tapestry designer and as a cartoon painter with the most successful master tapestry weavers in Brussels, returning again and again to projects with families like the De Pannemaker, De Kempeneer, and the De Moyens, Jan and Willem, who produced the Battle of Pavia, and its Van Orley designed pendant series, The Hunts of Maximilian. In 1541 to 42, Antwerp city account books, the Antwerp Magistracy acknowledged Coecke's contribution to local industry with his fostering, encouragements, and perhaps even teaching of the art of tapestry cartoon painting. Until his apparent move to Brussels in the later 1540s, Coecke straddled the artistic milieu between the two cities. Certainly the De Moyens, the weavers of the Battle of Pavia, had a much closer relationship with Coecke than with Van Orley. No sooner had they finished weaving the Battle of Pavia and the Hunts of Maximilian than they approached Coecke to, I quote Van Mander, make some things for them to show the Turkish emperor. This was their famous business endeavor, cultivating or trying to cultivate Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent as a potential client. It didn't work. Merchants Pieter van der Walle and Jan Relinge signed a contract with Willem de Moyen to create samples of new editions of tapestry series to tempt the Sultan. And as many in this audience will recall, the tapestries the merchants optioned to offer to the Sultan were re-editions of the Hunts of Maximilian and the Battle of Pavia. Although the tapestry projects proposed to Suleiman were after Van Orley's designs, it was Coecke, I propose their cartoon painter, who travelled to Constantinople on this mission. In Constantinople, Coecke drew the incredible drawings which resulted in the customs and fashions of the Turks print series that you can see here. In an ironic twist, one of Coecke's final tapestry projects before his untimely death in 1550 was when he was called in to troubleshoot a breached series of another of Charles's military exploits, his 4-month campaign to capture the city of Tunis from none other than Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. This astronomically expensive tapestry series had been designed by Jan Corneliszoon Vermeyen, who was a painter and printmaker to Charles, and he'd been part of the imperial retinue in Tunis to record the events. But Vermeyen was unused to tapestry medium, and he was floundering in the process of converting his small sketches into the scale and the narrative excitement of tapestry. Desperate, and here again we have a documentary trail to follow, which is very helpful. Desperate to placate his Habsburg patrons, Vermeyen turns to Coecke as a seasoned cartoon painter for belated collaboration to inject some life into his otherwise staid cartoons. in patches of the overall underwhelming Tunis, we can therefore recognize the technical proficiency and design mastery of the now mature Pieter Coecke, his interventions literally pasted on top of some of the surviving Conquest of Tunis cartoons. So we've got a detail here. Most of this is Vermeulen's cartoon, but then pasted on top, more in grisaille, we've got Pieter Coecke's interventions. Dying before he could finish, none other than Mary of Hungary regretted the decease of Peintre Maître Pierre as detrimental to the completing this turnaround of the Tunis series. So it took an artistic genius to transform the Louvre drawings' proficient record of the Battle of Pavia into the thrilling experience upstairs. Although Coecke's name is all but forgotten by posterity, probably because he worked primarily in tapestries, he was celebrated as one of the great artists of his time by contemporaries in the years immediately following his death. With the circumstantial and visual evidence that I've shared today in hand, I hope that in the future, Pieter Coecke van Aelst's transformational role as cartoon painter of the Battle of Pavia will be as readily acknowledged as his now is for the conquest of Tunis. Thanks so much. And if there are any, I think we've got plenty of time for some questions. Oh, yes. Oh, I think there will be a microphone coming to you for the benefit of if anyone's tuning in online. Here. Oh, well, we'll have that one
Sorry.
first.
Yeah, how do you distinguish between the artistic contribution of the cartoon painter and the weaver?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Yes, do we have another hour? And indeed, as I said at the beginning, the charm and the challenge of the tapestry medium is it's collaborative on so many levels, and certainly I wouldn't want you to go away from this presentation thinking that the weaver doesn't also bring something to hand. So certainly the weaver, often we see detailing in things like the palette in the materials used, if they're using simply wool and silk or whether they're using precious metal wrapped threads, can really change the overall effect of a tapestry. And certainly if they're using a lot of gold and silver threads, they're going to, in the best of cases like Willem de Pannemark, actually you can see in examples where they're holding themselves back somewhat from making it too much of a rainbow palette. Everything's in service to the glittering golden effect. Details like that, certainly the weaver, when they're choosing, when they've come to changes between different colors, for example, are they going to do hatching? Are they going to do a sharp difference with interlock or double interlocked? Those sorts of clever things, which again, everything contributes then to the final effect of the tapestry, absolutely in the weaver's domain. And you can see that in some series. For example, in the Met, we've got the Legend of Mercury and Hercey, which is woven in de Pannemarker's workshops, contemporary of de Moyen's upstairs. Yet there's another version surviving in Rome from the de Moyen workshop. They look completely different because they've been woven with different palettes, different threads, and certainly there is an element there. But I think decision-making of the nitty-gritty of a design, the placement of figures like we saw between the drawing and the tapestry of the foot, either on the banner or next to the banner, those are things that have to already be decided in the cartoon stage. Because don't forget, when the weavers are painting, they're facing the back of the tapestry. They're looking at the image actually turned on its side, because the cartoon would be on the side, tapestries are woven on their side. They're only seeing a small part of what will be the finished tapestry, because as they weave, the parts they've completed are rolled out of view on the roller at the bottom of the loom. So that sort of change has to be decided ahead of time on the cartoon, because if they're going to really start trying to improvise at that level, it could go horribly wrong, which you do sometimes see, when it is a weaver who does decide. So I think those are the sort of distinctions, but we can talk more about it if you're interested afterwards. Yeah.
This is a follow-up question, really. Thank you for pointing out the different collaborations.
can repeat your...
I've always been curious in the borders, like especially the flora and fauna of the borders, and whose purview does that fall? Is it different from...
So that's a fascinating question from the audience about the borders and into whose purview do the borders fall. And that's a very timely one, actually, with the Pavia series. Let's see if we go right back. I don't know. I know I have one with a border. In fact, what you can enjoy upstairs are the newly restored borders on many of the tapestries. You saw from some of Francesca's slides, pre-conservation, they had narrow red strips. So what we're looking at currently upstairs, even those with original border elements, those are fragments. And the actual Pavia original borders looked like those you can see here on the pendant series, the Hunts of Maximilians. We've got fruit and foliage on the sides and along the top, and then we've got this gorgeous sort of relief grisaille scene along the front. Incredibly important, as I mentioned, in that development of spatial play, sort of the ebb and flow or the tug and the pull between our space as viewers and the fictive space of the tapestries. And often in the best series like these, the borders actually seem to project out into our space. So every tapestry person you ask will have a different answer, because often we just don't know. But I would argue that in the best instances like this, it's absolutely the cartoon painter, someone like Pieter Coecke, who is absolutely attuned to the importance of the borders as part of the overall design to contribute to the effect they're giving. That said, often the borders are separate cartoon strips that they could be reused even more easily than the figurative cartoons of the tapestry. So we do often see the same borders being reused in different series. They're particularly successful. And likewise, rather more quirkily, we go forward a wee bit, in Pieter Coecke's series. So we've got his fantastic Seven Deadly Sins, this continuous procession. There are at least 4 different surviving editions of the Seven Deadly Sins, all woven in Brussels, all within 20 years, and each one has a different set of borders. But certainly the first 2 or 3 borders are all so successful, and they sort of carry on from each other certain elements, almost like a game of telephone. They take some, but they change others. That I've argued in the past that is, again, Pieter Coecke himself working with the weavers with whom he has a very close working relationship, going back and updating the borders to make them continually innovative. So we go from fruit and flowers to grotesques and so forth. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Once you've got me on a subject, I won't stop. So I will be dragged, kicking and screaming, like in the Oscars. You can play the music, and I'll close my. There we go. So, and I think this is probably the next one. There. Thank you.
Lizzie, thank you for a very thoughtful and very provocative talk. I think you're absolutely right that the scale of the Pavia tapestries was unprecedented in this era for their verisimilitude and detail, and it would be absolutely wrong to assume that Van Orley himself was responsible for the full realization that his team of cartoonists was critical in the development of the series, and much more is to be done in exploring the evolution of the workshop. I think, as we heard in the first, one of the critical things is this influence from Rome, and Vincitor would clearly have conveyed to Van Orley the nature of the Raphael workshop and the structure and the degree to which Van Orley delegated to very gifted artists like Giulio Romano and Giovanna Francesco Peni. So clearly the workshop that Van Orley is developing in the 1520s is beginning to model that practice and that delegation. And there's no question, I agree, that Van Orley Pieter Coecke van Aelst, this may really have been the big project on which he cut his teeth with Van Orley. I think the question of whether he was actually the the originator of the cartoons for Van Orley or a collaborator with Van Orley is something that needs to be further explored, not least because autograph cartoons that can be attributed to Van Orley, like the Passion series, the Alba Passion series, also have very clear echoes in the figures in the Pavia Tapestries. And we also know that one of the de Moyens, when he was being prosecuted for having listened to the radical priest preaching at Van Orley's house, claimed that he was just going there to see the cartoons. So the question of whether cartoons were produced at Van Orley's studio is something that needs more exploration. But very, very thought-provoking indeed. Thank you. We now turn. We're now going to be hearing from Anne Labordette, a curator of decorative arts at the Louvre since October 2019. Anne specializes in textiles, furniture, stained glass, and scientific objects of the Renaissance and of the first half of the 17th century. A graduate of Sciences Po Paris, where she graduated in 1998, and the Institut National du Patrimoine, where she graduated in 2003. She was previously at the head of the museums of Vernon, 2003 to 2006, and Douai from 2007 to 2019. And she will be joining us right now. Anne, where are you? Welcome to the stage.
Good morning. First, I want to thank Tom Campbell for this invitation to speak. I'm very proud to be here. And I would like to thank all the organizers of this symposium for their fantastic help, fantastic welcome here in San Francisco. I just hope my English will be clear enough for you to understand me. And please, I apologize for any default of pronunciation, and I hope you can follow me. I wanted to present a paper dedicated of the hunt of Maximilian, but I must confess that I didn't do any searches on it. So I take profit of this, the invitation of Tom, to present a work, a set on whom I am currently working on, a set dedicated to the history of Charles V. And indeed, the French state and the Louvre has only custody on this set, which is displayed today on Besançon, Musée du Temps, Palais Granvelle. The Granvelle family is very well linked to the history of Charles V and the Habsburg family. And these tapestries, the set is made up of 7 tapestries, each measuring approximately 4 meters in height, and depending on the pieces, between 2.5 and 5 meters in width. The set was particularly studied by Jacqueline Versip in 1955, then by Éric Duverger and Guy Delmarcel for their exhibition in Bruges in 1987. And more recently, the Victoria Ramirez Ruiz studies it in his PhD thesis dedicated on the collection of the Spanish aristocratic family in the 17th century. So, at first glance, the set presents 7 episodes in the life of Emperor Charles V, from his marriage to his retirement at the monastery of Yuste. And how does it implement propaganda around the imperial figure? So all the scenes are framed with the same type of borders, featuring garlands of wreaths, ribbons, and puttees, and in the lower section, a basket of flowers and a basket of fruits. And first, here, always, you have a cartouche inserted into each upper border, framed with 2 seated puttees, and each of these puttees, here in the first pieces of the set, each puttees is holding a long stick at the end of which hangs a brazier, an allusion to eternal love, as noted by Éric Duverger. So this symbol of eternal love echoes the Latin dedication in the cartouche, which summarized the subject of the scene while offering an interpretation of it, to Charles V's love of Lusitania. We must understand these phrases by noting that the scene is the wedding of Charles V with his cousin Isabella of Portugal, that you can see here on the foreground. And they both are holding their hands, and they are receiving the blessing of the apostolical nuncio. And if you like, on the background, you can see an altar pieces presenting the Virgin Mary, presenting the child Jesus to her holy woman. It's difficult to recognize the faces of both Charles and Isabella. The only faces that I recognize is here. It's certainly one of the sisters of Charles, Mary of Hungary, assisting the wedding, which took place indeed in Seville, in the Alcazar, just 1 year after the Battle of Pavia. And the question is, who is this man here on the foreground? But I will try to respond later. It's easier this way, sorry. Sorry. No. Yeah, maybe. I'm sorry, the second...
Moving it forward.
Yeah, okay.
Rich, can you give us a hand?
I'm sorry. The second piece I wanted to comment on is the... the coronation... here. The coronation of Charles V, which take place 4 years later after the previous scene, on February 24, 1530, in the San Petronio Church in Bologna, the sovereign's 30th birthday. And this tapestry depicts this through the puttees encircling the cartouche, each holding this way a palm of victory, while an imperial crown is placed at their feet. The same takes place in front of an altar pieces featuring an Annunciation scene on the left, and in the center, Pope Clement VII places the imperial crown on Charles Kneeling's head. He is assisted by 3 ecclesiastics, the archbishops of Cologne, Trier and Mainz, and on the right, a kneeling figure wears the collar of the golden fleece on a cushion, while on the left, a standing figure similarly holds the orb, representing the Christian world, reminding the monarch that he derives his power from God. The scepter also lies on the cushion, symbolizing power. What's equally striking here is the richness of the sumptuous textiles that make up much of the scene, from the carpets on which the emperor kneels to the shapes worn by the ecclesiastics. The tapestry, like the rest of the hanging, has no metallic threads, but the rendering of the metallic brocades and embroidery is particularly impressive. In the center, the golden mantle worn by the emperor features a double-headed eagle, emblem of the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Charles V had been elected emperor of the Holy Roman Empire few years ago. Few years ago, and he had to be coronated by the Pope to give his kingdom to his son. Otherwise, without this coronation by the Pope, the succession at the head of the Holy Roman Empire could be opened, and his enemy, François Ier, could have taken advantage of it. But fortunately, he was defeated in Pavia, as you know. The third piece is irresistibly reminiscent of an antique style triumph scene, is introduced by a cartouche where we can read "To the Liberator of Civilians." The scene depicts Charles V crowned with laurels, seated at top right on a chariot drawn by 3 horses. He is there. And he is talking to his brother Ferdinand. The double-headed eagle, emblem of the Holy Roman Empire, can be seen behind them, as well as on the standard unfurled by the armored warriors in the foreground. Still in the foreground, we see a figure in Hungarian dress, another in Turkish dress, representing the peoples defeated by the imperial armies. This composition, in which figures in 17th century costumes stand side by side with antique style figures, refers to Charles V's triumphal entry into Hungary in 1532 after the Turks had withdrawn. And to briefly summarize the situation, Charles had ceded his right to the Habsburg land to his brother Ferdinand, that you can see here, in 1521, marking the first step in the process of dividing the Habsburg into a Spanish and an Austrian branch. Ferdinand became then King of Bohemia and King of Hungary, and the situation displeased several Hungarian lords who called in the Turkish army to counter the Habsburg designs. The Turks occupied Hungary in 1529, laid siege to Vienna, and Charles V temporarily ended the occupation in 1532. So, what the tapestry doesn't show, because it gives the impression of a complete triumph, is in fact that the Turkish were always the enemy of Charles V, who never really defeated them. So we have just a part of the history of the emperor here. The 5th tapestry shows Charles V in majesty, enthroned at the top of a stairwell before the 2-headed eagle. Equipped with orb and scepter, he wears the imperial crown and mantle from his coronation in Bologna. The inscription in the cartouche once again explains the scene to the Duke of Saxony's conqueror, while the putti encircling the cartouche again hold the palms of victory. The Saxon Duke in question, you can see here in the foreground, is John Frederick I, also known as the Magnanimous, and he is shown standing in the right in full armor. As a sign of submission, he has laid the arms of Saxony at the emperor's feet, and both his sword and spear are broken, symbols of this defeat. The scene refers to the imperial army victory at Mühlberg in April 1547 against the Smalkalde League, a league that was done between the Protestant princes at the time, and from whom the northern, who belonged to the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, and of which the Duke of Saxony was a leading member. And these princes, who had converted to Lutheranism, wished to practice their faith in complete freedom. In so doing, they challenged the power of the emperor, the guarantor of the Catholic faith. So the tapestry here presents Charles V as a fervent defender of the Catholic faith. But as the tapestry doesn't show, is that many years later, the emperor will be obliged to let the Protestant prince practice their Protestant faith freely in their states. The subject of the 6th piece of the set is always introduced by this cartouche. This time it's dedicated to the one who despises kingdoms in sense of powers. And this is in fact the emperor's abdication scene as King of Spain, Aragon, Naples, and Sicily, and Duke of Burgundy, and he abdicates his power in favor of his son, Philip II, that you can see here on the foreground. The eastern part of the possession of Charles V were given to his brother Ferdinand. This is not a victory scene, even if the putti in the upper border each hold a palm in their hands, and even if the emperor is depicted here in majesty on a day. And contrary to the accounts left by some contemporaries who described the emperor on October 25, 1555, as ill and weak and crying at some points. Here you don't have any of this represented here. The scene depicts Charles V dressed in his coronation cloak, wearing the imperial crown, seated on a throne, where the double-headed eagle is once again visible. And you can see just next to him, his sister, Mary of Hungary, ruler of the Netherlands, but not for a long time anymore. And his son Philip is wearing the collar, the necklace of the holder of the Golden Fleece, and he solemnly accepts his father's letter, transferring power to him. And they are surrounded by three of the emperor's most important advisors at the time. On the left, you can see the Duke of Alba here. In the center, behind Philip, you can see Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, who will translate for the new king every message in Dutch or in French, as Philip II didn't speak any of the language of the new subjects of his kingdom. And on the right, you can see here Viglius Data, president of the Secret Council of the Lower Country. And the last pieces of the set shows Charles meditating in his bedroom at the monastery in Aelst, Spain, where he had retired after the abdication. The monastery can be seen in the left background here, and the putti still hold the palm of victory, but they are nevertheless bowing their heads. And the former emperor is richly dressed in a richly adorned room. He's shown seated meditating at the table, and the scene presenting all the symbols of a vanité scene or a memento mori scene. It gives us the impression that he has renounced the splendors of the world, as evidenced by the armor, swords, standards, and drum lying on the ground. He holds an olive wreath in one hand and a skull in another, while the imperial crown and scepter lie on the table. And his gaze is lost in contemplation of a painting in front of him, maybe a Trinity by Tiziano, while we know he had ordered such a painting to follow him in Aelst. And reminders of his coming end are visible: the crucifix, the candle, and above all, the wall clock that you can see here, ticking away the hours until death. And the image establishes a correspondence between the penitent and meditating saints valorized by the Counter-Reformation, in particular here with the image of Saint Jerome, the monastery of Aelst being more of a dependent of the Hieronymite order, so in link to the Saint Jerome figure. And what really catches the eyes, however, is the vividness of the red textile used to furnish his bed and table, while all the contemporaries described his room in Aelst as fine with black textiles. So that's the first level of understanding the set, and I was really impressed to see that the set is always depicted and commented as a history of Charles V. But indeed, my opinion is there is another level of understanding all the set, and in length with context in which the work was created. Dating it is relatively easy. Éric Duverger and Guy Delmarcel noted that the set can hardly have been woven after 1635, given that the Bruges town mark visible in some selvages is no longer woven in this way after this date. And some scenes in the set cannot have been woven before the preparation of an important arrival. I mean the arrival of the new governor of the Netherlands, the Cardinal Infant Ferdinand of Habsburg. A preparation for the arrival began in Ghent in 1634. So all of these places, the weaving of the work, in particular political context, That is the transfer of power from the Archdukes of Austria, that you can see here on the left of the screen, who governed the southern Netherlands from the end of the 16th century to 1621. And they transfer their power to the new governor appointed in 1622, the King Philip's the fourth brother, the Cardinal Infant Ferdinand of Habsburg. However, Ferdinand did not take up his post until after the death of his aunt, the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia, which occurred in 1633. And before arriving in the Netherlands, Don Ferdinand scored one of the most decisive victories for the Catholic in the 30 Years' War, the 1634 Battle of Nördlingen, defeating the Swedish Protestant army. And by this time, the war has been indeed raging for 16 years between the Habsburg of Spain and Austria, defending the Catholic faith on one part, and the Protestant state is allied with France, always France, the enemy of the Habsburg, on the other side. And on the religious front, the era is marked by the papacy desire to re-Catholicize peoples who had embraced Protestant ideas. And to his end, in 1622, Pope Gregory XV notably found the Sacra Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, charged with propagating Catholicism. So, whenever a new governor was appointed by the imperial power to administrate the Netherlands on behalf of the emperor, it was traditional for him or for her to do a joyeuse entrée or blijde inkomst, which means a triumphal entry in the main towns of the territory. And I would mark the start of a new contract. It would mark the start, of a new contract between the new sovereign and his or her territories. And each town welcomed him or her with a series of festive events. And between 1634 and 1635, the Cardinal Infant Ferdinand undertook a series of joyeuses entrées to the cities of Brussels, Mechelen, Bruges, Ghent, and finally Antwerp. And the Ghent event was organized by the city magistrates and the city's Jesuit college, this organizer deciding to exalt the figure of Ferdinand as the winner of Nördlingen. Archives found and analyzed by Domian Rogen and Hans Vliege show that preparation for the entry of the Cardinal Infant began at the end of 1634, and that the city of Ghent chose to compare the figure of the Cardinal Infant with that of his great-grandfather, Charles V, who was born in Ghent. And the people here in Ghent were very proud of that. And so consequently, Charles V became for Ferdinand a kind of speculum principis, a sort of figure to imitate, a person to follow for the way of governing the Netherlands. And here you can see the beginning of the entry on the screen, which takes place on the Ghent Vrijdagmarkt at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 28, 1635. The horsemen have just passed under an ephemeral triumphal arch on which episodes from Ferdinand's life were painted, amid allegorical and mythological scene. And all the horsemen with the Cardinal Infant are about to pass under another triumphal arch that you can see in the background. And this time, this arch is dedicated to the figure of Charles V. And thank Willem van der Becke, Guillemulus Beccanus, who made printed the result of all the fests, all the events given by the city of Ghent for this entry. We have chance to know and to a little bit more of what happened this day and how were the arch built. And Guillaume van der Becke, who was a Jesuit priest, had asked several artists to collaborate to this publication, among them Cornelis Coote. And here you can see detail of the front of the triumphal arch dedicated to Charles V. At the top, you can see the sculptures of the various governors of the Netherlands seated, while Charles V meets his great-grandson, a scene under which hangs a painting by Gaspard de Crayer, a painter affiliated to the Brussels Guild of Paintings, whom the organizers of the Joyeuse Entrée had commissioned to paint 8 pictures on the life of Charles V at the end of 1634. And as you can see here, the painting is preceded by 3 others on the lower floor. On the left, you can see an image of the Battle of Pavia, and what is striking in all the sets dedicating to the history of Charles V, here it's lacking a scene presenting the Battle of Pavia, so it may be, and that's the hypothesis of Jacqueline Versipt, the set could have comprised 8 pieces, the Battle of Pavia, so. And what is striking too is that the painting by Gaspard de Crayer, and I must apologize, I didn't manage to have pictures and colored pictures of it. The pictures by Gaspard de Crayer representing the Battle of Pavia serves as model for another pieces of the set, which represents the captures of the conquest of Tunis. So it's very interesting to see that the model there are a lot of difference between the painting model and the tapestry, and that Battle of Pavia changed the figures of the King of France into the figure of the Emperor. And the subject of the 8 paintings ordered to de Crayer are known through the archives left in Ghent, and we can note that only a part of them corresponds to the subject of the sets of the history of Charles V. The submission of the German princes to Charles V, it's okay, you saw it on the arches. The captures of Francis I at the Battle of Pavia, which was so transformed into a conquest of Tunis, the coronation of Charles V, a painting for which de Crayer was strongly inspired by Rubens, as well as by an engraving of Pieter de Jode. I didn't find a picture of the painting now in the City Hotel of Gand, but a copy after it, that you can see here on the screen, now displayed in the Musée of Montauban in France. The last painting by de Crayer, which served as a model for the set of the history of Charles V, is Charles V handing over his power to his son Philip II. Today, part of these paintings are lost, but 3 of them are preserved in the City Hotel in Ghent. So, the context of the realization of the models of some tapestry gives another meaning to the set. Only the achievements of Charles V are depicted, especially when they concern the affirmation and defense of the Catholic faith. It's indeed a propaganda to the glory of the emperor, who passes over his defeats and difficulties encountered in the exercise of this reign. But more than that, I think it's a propaganda too to the glory of those who, like Charles V, are able to govern the Netherlands and the territories of the Habsburg by fighting the Protestant heresy without compromise. And such a position was in particularly held by the Jesuits at the time. So, one of the remaining mysteries to be clarified is that of the sponsor of the work, which would certainly offer a third level of understanding all the sets. Jacqueline Versip thought it could be the city of Bruges, where the Cardinal Infant has also made a joyeuse entrée, and Bruges could have been willing to offer Ferdinand a copy of Savoir-faire, in which the weavers of Bruges were still well known at the beginning of the 17th century. But, as she pointed out, no archives were found in that sense, and I checked, I've found nothing. So maybe, by the same token, one could think of the city of Ghent but I hardly try to explore the city archives as the Rijksarchives. And for the moment, for me, it's like climbing the Everest by the North Face, and I don't find anything. And I see here Conrad Brosens, maybe he could help. An idea expressed by both Hans Vliege, and a specialist of the choir, and Éric Duverger, is to consider that the figure here at the foreground could be the sponsor, who would be here depicted. And indeed, the other participants in the scene wear costumes evoking both the Renaissance and the early 17th century, while he is standing and while he is wearing a typical Spanish suit from the 1630s. On the other hand, you can note that it looks at the viewer and he is not located quite in the same space as the other. So Vliege and Duverger proposed to identify him with the figure of Francisco de Moncada, Marquis of Aelst and Count of Osuna, a Spanish diplomat, soldier and writer, and also a general and commander of the Spanish-Flemish armies, who became then a talentuous interim governor of the Spanish Netherlands between the death of the Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia and the arrival of the Cardinal Infant in 1634. And he was charged, as René Vermeer pointed it, by King Philip IV to survey the Cardinal Infant. We know that through the letters sent between the kings and Francisco de Moncada. But, as noted Éric Duverger too, Francisco de Moncada died in August 1635, so it's difficult to explain if he had time enough to order the tapestry to be woven. And I wanted to finish and to conclude with the history of the tapestry that interested me a lot this last few years. The history of tapestry is unknown. Victoria Ramírez Ruiz thinks that maybe Francisco de Moncada could have been the sponsor of the tapestry, but when she explored all the archives of the Moncada families, she didn't find any evidence in the inventory testimonies that he or his descendants could have possessed this tapestry set. So, for the moment, it's still an open question to answer. The fact is that it was rediscovered at the end of 19th century by a rich Frenchman that you can see here on the screen, Félix Sivet, who, according to a family tradition, would have bought the seven tapestry at the very end of the 1880s in Spain. So I continue to investigate this track, which for the moment has not yielded anything more. And he acquired them when he achieved a high level of social recognition, having been made a Knight of the Légion d'honneur at the end of the 80s, and seeking to decorate his castle of Saint-Maximin near Paris, which he had built at the end of 1870. After the death of Félix Sivet, his heirs put the tapestries on sale at the beginning of the 20th century, attributing them to a workshop in Brussels. And I still don't know why, but one of the sons of Félix Sivet, Léon, that you can see here, buys the tapestry at the sale for an amount of 60,000 francs. That means quite millions of dollars today. And it's not the end. Léon Sivet keeps the tapestries in the Saint-Maximin castle and tries to sell them during the interwar period. Several sales projects were carried out, but none was successful. In June 1940, the Château de Saint-Maximin was seized by the German army, and one of the members of the Sivet family was imprisoned in Germany. So Léon Sivet decided to repatriate the tapestry in his Parisian mansion to avoid them being stolen or degraded by the occupant. And at the end of the year, the same year, Henri Aumetre, a merchant and restorer of carpets and tapestries, whom he has already contacted before the war, offers to buy the set. Sivet accepts, and you can compare all the prices given in the same month, in the same year for all the sets. From the moment where Léon Sivet sells them to Henri Aumetre, and the moment where Henri Aumetre, which has a lot of money to give to many persons who helped him to buy the tapestry, Henri Aumetre so decided to sell the set to Gabriel Chénier-Duchesne, a specialist Parisian merchant specializing in tapestry, for more than 3 million francs at the time. It was a huge amount. And Gabriel Chénier-Duchesne sells the set to Sepp Ungerer, a representative of Hermann Göring in Paris, for more than 3 million francs. And at each step, you have to imagine that all these people, Henri Aumetre and Gabriel Chénier-Duchesne, have to give a lot of money to other persons, while this other person, among them 2 American women, helps them to find a rich person who can buy the tapestry. At the end, Sepp Ungerer sells the tapestry to Hermann Göring for 4 million francs, but discovered at the same time that the initial prices of the set was very less than what he paid. So at the end of the war, we know that Sepp Ungerer wanted to provide Hermann Göring with a Gothic tapestry, and that he only managed to buy this set dedicated to the figure of Charles V, maybe evocating an old dream of Charles V to reunite Europe around behind an empire, and maybe thinking that this theme could interest Hermann Göring. By the way, Göring himself didn't took any attention to the set, and at the end of the war, it was rediscovered by the American Monuments Men in Bavaria. Then repatriated to France, where the French judge thought that both Aumetre and Chénier-Duchesne has betrayed the patrie, so confiscated the set, and that's why it's always today in custody of the French state. But you know, all my occupation today is to decide if Léon Sivet, the former owner of this set tapestry, was really informed of all the steps of the sales and buys. So I think I have too much spoken. I really apologize for all the technical problem for my defiant English, and thank you for your attention.
So, because we're running a little over time, one of our speakers is indisposed. So we're going to move the 4th talk of the morning to this afternoon. Konrad Brozens will be the first speaker at 2:00. So what I'm going to do now is ask our 3 speakers from the morning to come down to centre stage. We'll take a couple of questions first for Anne, and then we'll have general questions. Maria, do we get some chairs?
Yeah.
So any questions? Maybe any questions for Anne? Thank you for that great talk. Really, it expanded our Charles V from Pavia outwards and gave us an overview of many of these issues. So thank you.
I just wanted to know, where can we see them in Besançon?
Yes.
Where?
It's on public display in the first floor of the Palais Granvelle. Use the microphone, please.
Thank you.
Yes, you can see the set, which is all displayed in the first floor of the Palais Granvelle in Besançon.
Thank you, Anne, for a fantastic presentation. I have a question just about a minor comment you made at the very end about Goering's possible interest in a tapestry with an imperial subject. I know you've been looking at the provenance of works of art in this period. Is this something you've encountered, that Nazis had an interest in works of art with imperial subject matter or Germanic imperial subject matter, or do you think it's a coincidence?
When I first started to study all the story of this tapestry set, I was convinced it was bought because of summoning the figure of Emperor Charles V during the German occupation could be for Goering a way of positioning himself as a leader and the continuator of the work of Charles V. Today, I'm convinced that in fact, he didn't took a lot of attention to the set. Because at the time he was only interested in looking and finding in Paris Gothic tapestries. That means a tapestry of the pre-Renaissance or of the Middle Ages with a lot of hunting scenes and a lot of portraits of kings. And it's a little bit, how to say in English, par hasard, that Sepp Ungerer was informed, by chance, thank you, that Sepp Ungerer was informed that this set existed. Sepp Ungerer wanted to buy another Gothic tapestry. He didn't really manage, so he took occasion to buy this set. And I think he took occasion to buy this set because he could take in the passage a lot of money. Because, you know, he sent an invoice of 4 million of francs to Goering, and he only paid 3.5 million. And I think, indeed, it's just quite a coincidence. For the person who studied a lot of the Goering collection of tapestries is first Anja Preussel-Kammerer and today Barbara Schroeter. And we are working with her, and it's quite a coincidence. But first, I was convinced it was not. Today, not so sure.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for Elizabeth Cleland because of your exhibit in Cleveland on the Valois tapestries. And it's about the borders. And are they, because there is that new panel in Bordeaux that doesn't have a border on it, I'm wondering if the borders are actually part of the cartoon, they're woven into, they're not sewn onto. Is that correct, the Valois tapestries that you displayed in Cleveland?
Thank you. It's nice to that you're recalling that earlier show. Yes, so the Valois tapestries, the borders are integral to the weave, and we actually also have Pascal Bertrand here in the audience who's speaking tomorrow, I believe, who has published a lot on the Valois series. So Pascal should please step in if I misspeak. So in that instance, they are integral to the design. However, I hope no one will take it amiss of me if I suggest that the borders of the Valois tapestries are not terribly exciting. We don't have any of the sort of spatial acrobatics of using them as a gateway into the tapestries the way we see in these the Brussels tapestries, which we talked about today, which are maybe about 30 years earlier. So by that point, I think you certainly one could make a case that the borders which the weavers are using there were perhaps separate cartoons, which we do see very similar ones being used in other series. There's one other tapestry in a collection in France, and I'm afraid I'm blanking on exactly where, which also has the same unknown weaver's markers on the Valois tapestries, and it has a very similar border. So I think that's just stock. So it's a very special moment in Brussels around the period of the 1520s, 1530s, 1540s, where I think the most spectacular tapestries are being created.
Hello, thank you all of you for your wonderful presentation. My question will go to Lizzie. you show us a very convincing an explanation about the way the cartoonists inject life into the drawing to make them. I wonder. Well, I think that there's a few decades, then the tapestry benefit from a different approach, which means to consider them all one set in as a whole and not each tapestry after the other. But what you say about the landscape, the possibility that Pieter Coecke helped Van Orley on the landscape, do you see this collaboration at the stage of the drawing or later at the cartoon? Because for me, it's not the same scale. To appreciate the scale, the continuity of scale between all the panels, that means that you have to be able to see all of them together. All that. Do you understand my question?
Yes, so definitely. So Cecilia Paredes, who is the person who published first this fantastic idea of the panoramic landscape. So I'm very much standing on your shoulders with this. I think the proof is in the pudding is whether or not the Louvre drawings are the final petit patron. Because if those are the petit patron, then an awful lot of work was done at the large patrons, the patron op groot stage, the actual cartoons. And so that is if there was a second set of more detailed petit patron, which we've lost, in which much more attention is paid to the foreground and the background, then I would personally feel happier putting that very much in Van Orley's court. But if this is it, then a lot is done at the cartoon stage, patron op groot. And that, again, to go back to Tom's comment, I think it's the question of vocabulary. It's so frustrating because when we do have documents, they usually just talk about patronen, which can be both. So, yes, we know Van Orley has patronen, but are they op klein, the small drawings, or op groot, the big ones, which is the big question. And certainly, if we see some sort of collaborative dialogue between Van Orley and Coecke, then perhaps it's a coming together of two great minds. But I certainly feel that Pieter Coecke is one of these unsung geniuses. Some people in the audience here know. I spent a long time applauding Coecke as the great inventor of a lot of the spatial acrobatics, particular to tapestry. But it's still very much, there's a lot still to be done and to be said. But thank you.
Hello, I have a question for Francesca. I was very interested in the Fechtbücher you were discussing, and I was wondering if you could put those in some more context. Are there other artists who are drawing from them? Do you see echoes of that imagery in other tapestries or other media? It was a really interesting visual comparison, so thank you all for wonderful talks.
So they're not usually cited as potential sources for battle scenes, but they are exceptionally common. There's a lot of them, and they very often they tend to repeat the same formulas over and over with different details. The other thing that I do that I think it's really interesting is that they, as I mentioned, they update the catalog of weapons being used, which I think is crucial in this case, because people that fight with alabards are very different from soldiers that fight with swords and daggers and shields, right? So the engagement happens at a larger distance. You're standing at more of a distance from your enemy. And we know that they are used for tournaments a lot. So, for example, they're often the first that I showed is used over and over again by historians of arms and armor that study the tournaments at Binch. So during the second occasion of display of the tapestries. So they are actually that specific one is dated to the 1530s. So again, I'm not claiming an exact sort of derivation, but a lot of the motifs, and especially this almost obsessive pointing at the throat that you see in all of the two-figure engagements on the battlefields, It's the only place where I find something similar. When we look at Italian battle scenes that most often sort of refer to classical reliefs, that's missing. So that, and also the figure that it's turning the back to the enemy, that's also unprecedented. So when I started sort of focusing on it and I started seeing it appearing over and over again on the battlefield, I was really struck. That's something that really sort of like jumps up, I think. Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up there. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to return at 2 o'clock for the second session. We're going to hear 2 speakers this afternoon. So thank you to the first group. That was great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Freeman. I'm Assistant Curator of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture here at the Fine Arts Museums, and I was curator for our presentation of the Battle of Pavia Tapestries exhibition. So thank you to all the speakers and everyone this morning. It was a fabulous group of talks. Thank you all to those joining online. Someone reported there were around 200 people at some point. So no pressure to our next speakers. Also a reminder, please turn off your phones. You know, when we're lost in tapestry world, we don't want any modern interruptions. And we're going to start now. We'll have 2 speakers this afternoon. 3? Okay, 3 speakers this afternoon. So we'll hear from each, have time for Q&A for each speaker, and then at the end, if there's time, we'll have a group Q&A. So our first speaker is Koen Broosens, professor in art history and vice dean of programs at the University of Leuven. He has published widely on Flemish and French tapestry and European markets for tapestry. Koen was principal investigator of Project Cornelia, a slow digital art history project developed in collaboration with the university's computer science department. He is now co-PI of Representation in Image and Art, 2022-2029, an interdisciplinary project that interfaces conceptual and theoretical frameworks and methodologies from experimental psychology, perception studies, neuroscience, media studies, aesthetics, and art history. Koen has been a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and also he's very familiar with California. He was once previously the Peter Paul Rubens Chair at the University of California, Berkeley, and a J. Paul Getty Museum Scholar. And I also want to add, he is a big fan of all things Bob Dylan. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see my PowerPoint presentation, so you know. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me. It's an absolute delight and honor to be here today. It also has another side of the story, because I have to start with an apology. I have to start with an apology because I'm also celebrating an anniversary today. Exactly 30 years ago, on January the 10th, 1995, my wife and I first kissed, and we have been together ever since. And we made a vow, we promised each other that we would always be together on January the 10th. So, in my defense, it's only the second time that I miss the anniversary. The first time was when Tom invited me for another tapestry symposium. So Tom, be careful when you meet Katrien, right? So Katrien, you might have gone to bed already, but apologies. I hope you will forgive me. And also, perhaps now you have more time during this weekend to do all the things I wasn't able to do because I was working on this on this paper. So you have a whole list of things to do in and around the house this weekend. Thank you. All right. So great. We start with the lecture. What are we going to do today? We are going to explore together how the relationship, tapestry, and propaganda changed over the course of the 18th century. And how are we going to do this? We will focus on a work of art that no longer exists. That's the throne ensemble of John V of Portugal that was completed around 1730. And we will also focus on a work of art that has never existed. This is the throne ensemble of Empress Maria Theresa, which was sort of conceptualized around 1755. And so how are we going to proceed in the next 25 minutes? I divided a paper in 3 parts. Part 1, perhaps it makes sense to tell you more about what a throne ensemble actually is. Second part, you will get a mental picture of the throne ensemble made for John V of Portugal as part of a larger tapestry is propaganda agenda. And the second part, the final part, part 3, then we will eavesdrop on conversations between imperial diplomats, and we will witness how Empress Maria Theresa had little interest in tapestry as a propagandic tool. So, if you love tapestry, it's quite a depressing talk, I have to warn you, because, yeah, I don't have anything to show you, basically, and I can only tell stories about things that have disappeared or have never been made. Which brings me in a unique position, I think. So I'm making my wife unhappy so that I can make you all unhappy. Yeah, perhaps I have to rethink life choices. Anyway, so part 1. What is a throne ensemble? A throne ensemble looks a bit like this. Starting from the bottom, first we have a podium, right? And then on the podium you have 1 or 2 chairs. And these are usually upholstered chairs, so with textiles. And then hanging behind the chair or chairs is a large tapestry. And then hovering over the chair or chairs is a canopy or baldachin that's also a tapestry. And that baldachin tapestry can have valances, right? And so what is depicted or what can be depicted on these tapestries, allegorical figures, this can be heraldic emblems, medallions with scenes from classical history, Bible or mythology, coat of arms. So basically anything that helps to self-fashion the image of the person or persons sitting on the chair. And so basically you could say that a throne ensemble was a very magnificent work of art and an effort to convince people to change their ideas and to make an impression. So basically, throne ensembles were absolutely very powerful tools of propaganda. I'm bringing you these 2 17th century images to show you how it all worked in real life, so to speak. So this is, yeah, it happens, okay. So these are 2 late 17th century engravings of the English queen, English king, sitting on a throne, sitting inside a throne ensemble, so to speak, being visited and or in the company of politicians and diplomats and noblemen. And it's really important to see that, so the throne ensemble is usually part of a bigger textile environment. This is a very famous depiction. This shows the abdication of the Emperor Charles V around the middle of the 16th century. And again, you can see the throne ensemble with the chairs. And it's actually interesting to see he's getting out of the chair. And in Dutch, we say troonsafstand, which basically translates into, we also say abdicatie. But troonsafstand is a much better word, I think, because it means taking distance from the chair. And so that's what he's doing over there. Yeah, and so of course, textiles, they can, well, they are vulnerable. And also as symbols of power, you can imagine that angry mobs unfolding a revolution did not necessarily like throne ensembles. So I think, yeah, almost all of them have disappeared. So you have time and people, and if you bring time and people together and tapestry, that's usually, well, that's what happens then. Tapestries disappear. But we have a couple of examples, and these are simply breathtaking works of art. I think if a designer, if a tapestry producer was commissioned a throne ensemble, they went the extra mile, no doubt about it. So, all clear? Alrighty. Then, the second part, a mental picture of the throne ensemble made for John V of Portugal. A mental picture because it was produced and it was also shipped to Lisbon, but it disappeared with about 85% of Lisbon actually on All Saints' Day, I think it's called, 1755, when there was a major earthquake and a tsunami that followed, and basically it wiped away Lisbon and a lot of works of art, of course. And this morning we also had a little Coecke thing going on at 7 or 7:30. So yeah, I think it's very dangerous perhaps to talk about earthquakes in San Francisco. Don't want to jinx it. Anyway, so that disappeared. So we don't have the actual works of art, but we have a lot of archival documents. And if there's one thing I like to do I like to do archival research. I like to do a lot of things, but archival research is always great. And so I did a lot of archival research when I had more time to do that. And we have a lot of archival documents helping us to understand what the John V throne looked like, and also how the whole project unfolded between the fall of 1727 and the spring of 1731. So Anne, you asked me to help you with doing archival research. Would be more than happy to do that, and I'll send you the invoices later, because it's very difficult, it's very time consuming. So, but anyway. Okay, and so based on the historical record, it is possible to sort of imagine what the ensemble looked like. We have a very brief description, and we know that the ensemble was designed by a Brussels painter that is not really famous, I think, Jan van der Heijden. But he did a lot of, well, very similar things, not only for the Brussels tapestry producers. But anyway, and a couple of years ago, a student of mine, but he was not working on the throne ensemble. He was working on a 19th century painter, but he also liked painting. And I asked him, can you help me make this sketch? So this is Steven's work. And so this gives you a first idea of, on the left, the tapestry hanging behind the chair, and that's the canopy or the baldaquin tapestry. We also have, and this is an actual 18th century sketch by the Parisian artist Juste Aurel Meissonnier, and this is probably what the chair, what the throne actually looked like, which means that we can do a little bit of play with it, right? So Jan van der Heijden designed, we have Meissonnier for the chair, and we know, again, archival data shows that the tapestries were executed by two Brussels tapestry producers, entrepreneurs, so never call them weavers, they are businessmen. They are businessmen, and they are very wealthy businessmen. They they had political ambitions. They had a lot and sold a lot of real estate. So basically, these were very wealthy entrepreneurs. And so they produced, right, the ensemble. What I did is to make it a bit more into tapestry. I used 2 existing tapestries, details of existing tapestries, to give you a better tapestry feel of what a throne might have looked like. So a tapestry with the coat of arms of William III. And also, and this is really exceptional, in a private collection is a Brussels canopy tapestry woven around 1690. And so you can take some figures out of it. It must have been something like that. It must have been a brilliant work of art, I think. Usually I don't mind losing things, and I don't think it's our duty to keep everything people ever made in the past, and also works of art, they disappeared. That's what it is. But I really feel sorry that we don't have the throne ensemble, because I think it would have been a magnificent work of art. And John V, he really liked tapestry. We know that he commissioned a lot of tapestry series in Brussels, but also in Paris, right? So Brussels was the most important production center throughout the 16th and 17th century. But then you see at the end of the 17th century and 18th century, the Parisian workshops of the Gobelins, they became more and more important. So, but Brussels producers, again, Vermillon and Laniers, but also Eudokus de Vos, they produced a lot of tapestries that were then sent to Lisbon. And interestingly, the tapestry series preceded the throne ensemble. So the throne ensemble really was the crown piece of everything they produced. And one of these series depicted the history of Telemaque. So, but also these tapestries have disappeared because, well, perhaps not all of them, that's something that still needs to. But anyway, so the Lisbon earthquake sort of wiped away the tapestry legacy of John V of Portugal, who basically wanted to make Lisbon into a new Paris, and he wanted to build this palace and the interior as a new Versailles. Okay, so he liked tapestries as a propaganda, as a tool of propaganda, but also the Brussels producers. Yeah, that was a promise I made in the beginning. You will also see this project through the eyes of the Brussels producers. That's happening right now. So when the throne ensemble was finished, Laniers and Vermillon, so the 2 producers, they invited important people. They invited important people to come to the workshop and admire the ensemble. We know that the Archbishop of Brussels, Mechelen, came to visit. And we know that they brought the throne ensemble to the palace in Brussels, the royal palace in Brussels, to show it to the Archduchess Maria Elizabeth of Austria, who was then governor of the Austrian Netherlands, and she was a sister-in-law of John V of Portugal. So there was a connection there. So they brought it to the palace, right? And then fortunately, doesn't matter because then the earthquake happened. Perhaps you know that the Brussels palace burned down in 1731, and in the record it says 2 days before the palace burned down. So the throne ensemble escaped the fire in Brussels and then fell prey to the fire in Lisbon. So it's really a sad story. Huh? It's quite depressing. Anyway, and they also showed it to Prince Charles-Alexandre Emmanuel de Lorraine, who after the Archduchess became the governor of the Austrian Netherlands. So they were really trying to push and show people, this is what we can do, this is what Brussels tapestry means. So for them it was also a tool of propaganda. Right, a tool of propaganda, but I think they might have regretted doing that because the Portuguese court, well, doing that, I mean, as in delivering tapestries to the Portuguese court, because the Portuguese court failed to pay for what they had ordered, which is very common, actually, I think. If you study tapestry, you know that the more prestigious the commission, the likelier the chance that the commissioner would never pay for what they had commissioned. Yeah, so they tried and they tried, right? The Brussels producers, they tried and they tried. Money never came through. And when they died, Vermillon and Laniers, the Throne Ensemble still was not paid for. And also some of the other tapestry sets delivered to John V of Portugal were never actually paid for. Keep that in mind, keep that in mind. All right, all clear, second part, we can move on. Yep, all right. Part 3, that is a fun part, I think, because now we will, eavesdrop, we will read bits and pieces of correspondence between really important people. And we will discover that while John V believed in tapestry, that the Empress unfortunately had little or no interest in tapestry as a propagandic tool. And again, so basically this is about the Throne Ensemble that never materialized. People discussed it, but it was never materialized. Unfortunately, again, we have a lot of archival documents that help us to understand how this project was conceived between November 1755. So Lisbon was still very much shaken. And we'll see that there was a new plan immediately following the earthquake. We need a couple of people. You can only, if you simply can memorize the very last name, like Kobenzel, Starenberg, Taruka, and the Empress, we don't need her that much. So it's Kobenzel, Starenberg, Taruka. Kobenzel, he was the, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but anyway, I'll try, the minister plenipotentiary of the Austrian Netherlands in Brussels. So basically, the boss of the Austrian Netherlands, but not really, because he had to listen to Taruka, so the third person there, because Taruka, he was a close friend of the Empress. He was there when she was born, so an old family friend. And he was not only the imperial architect, but also the president of the Council of the Austrian Netherlands, and he was in Vienna. So Kobenzel and Taruka, they were in constant communication, right? At one point, Starenberg will appear in my story. He was also a close confidant of the Empress, and at the time, 1755, he was imperial envoy in Paris. And then, I also included a map of the Austrian Empire, including the Austrian Netherlands. And the Austrian Netherlands, that's basically present-day Belgium, more or less. So she had a big empire to deal with. Okay. So we start, and it's like reading email, sort of. So it started in 1755 in November. So almost immediately after the Lisbon earthquake, Kobenzel, residing in Brussels, wrote to Taruka and he said, I would like to commission a throne ensemble for the Empress from tapestry producers here in Brussels, just like the one they made for the King of Portugal about 30 years ago. He doesn't say that, and now it is destroyed in Lisbon, perhaps he didn't even, but he sort of, the earthquake made him and possibly the producers realize, oh, and what about this throne ensemble? So he saw his chance, Kobenzel, and he said, but this new ensemble will be even more magnificent. And then Taruka, well, so he's writing this, but the correspondence between Kobenzel and Taruka, that's meters and meters of archival material. So this short passage is part of a letter that goes about military campaigns, about really important political decisions. So it's just smuggled in somewhere. And then, interestingly, Taruka immediately replies and he says, okay, thank you, but no thank you. But he said it politely. We are going to discuss the idea, but we can already inform you, and the we is basically Taruka, right? I can already say that we're not going to commission a complete throne ensemble like the one you did for, for John V. And then Kobenzel, that's really interesting to see, he went into denial. He simply said, he doesn't really answer Taruka, he simply said, oh, but would it be possible to send me the dimensions for the throne? And I have already commissioned a design here in Brussels. And probably I will send it to Paris after completion so that it can be developed further in Paris. I think in French they say corriger even, so corrected. So Cobenzel sort of realizes Brussels might have been a little bit too much 17th century for the Empress. Let's see if we can use the Parisian route. Okay. Then in January, without waiting for any more news from Taruka, Cobenzel says, I'm going to write a letter to Starrenberg. No, they're writing a lot of letters. In one of these letters, I'm going to mention this throne idea. And he says, Cobenzel, the Empress wants me to oversee the production of a throne ensemble like the one they made for the King of Portugal about 30 years ago. It's not really true, but we all know how to manipulate people, right? So it's part of the... and this new ensemble will be even more magnificent. And then he says, I would like to have a beautiful design by one of the... I forgot of. So I would like to have a beautiful design by one of the best artists working at the Gobelin tapestry manufactory. Would it be possible to make this happen? You are in Paris, please reach out to a designer. So now you see that Cobenzel, he has a design in the works in Brussels, and he said, I'm also going to ask a second one, because I really want to have this throne made, and I need to dazzle the Empress. Starrenberg, possibly, I haven't seen the correspondence between Starrenberg and the Empress, but there must have been letters. He didn't really... Yeah, there was this one short sentence in a letter to Cobenzel. Thank you, I have received your request. And in April, so we're moving in time, Cobenzel writes and says, oh, I'm waiting impatiently for you to send me the design. And then, really interestingly, the design was sent, because in June, Cobenzel informs Taruka in a letter, I am sending you a design for the throne, a throne that was never mentioned in the months before, anyway, and I had asked Starrenberg to commission it from a painter in Paris. So the Brussels design, sort of, was it still being worked on? Was it forgotten? We come to that in a minute. Taruka immediately replies, yeah, but we cannot confirm that we will commission a throne, which is a polite way to say, leave us alone. And also, if we would decide to commission a throne ensemble, perhaps we'll commission it from the Gobelin and not from the Brussels tapestry producers, which is basically hitting Cobenzel in the face. Because Cobenzel's mission was to make sure that it's going to be a Brussels-made ensemble. And then, again, this Cobenzel guy is really amazing, complete denial, because in September he sends the second design. I'm sending you a design for the throne. It is made by a Brussels painter. And then the historical record becomes silent. No throne ensemble was made. And there are reasons for that, of course. One of the reasons is that Maria Teresa and Taruka, they were very busy modernizing the age-old imperial palace in Vienna, the Hofburg. And they saw no need, and they felt that tapestry was a thing of the past, basically. And so you'll see, this is a painting where the Empress is sitting on a throne. There's a textile behind her, there's a canopy, but it's not the traditional, so to speak, ensemble. And what happened there is that also in the archival record, the Brussels tapestry producer, Cobenzel was really isolated, right? For John V, all these Brussels tapestry producers, they said, yeah, we have to collaborate together, we're going to make this throne ensemble. For Maria Teresa, they said, nah, we're not going to be involved, or we don't want to be involved necessarily. Also, the design in Brussels, that took almost a year. How difficult can it be to make a quick sketch? And what's happening there is that if you know the history of Brussels tapestry, it went downhill after 1730, 1740. So the industry was in decline. The Brussels tapestry producers had no idea, or they didn't want to have this prestigious commission because, again, they would spend a lot of time, they would invest a lot of money, there would be transaction costs, there would be information asymmetries. So it would be a nuisance and not something they would like to do as tapestry producers. So they also said, just forget it, basically. See? Depressing, right? Okay. This brings me to the end of my paper. I would very much like to thank a couple of people. Tom, in the first place. Tom is one of the reasons why I became a tapestry scholar, actually, because I did my dissertation with Guy Delmarcel, who was mentioned in the start. Guy, I hope you're watching this. But at one point I felt, tapestry, perhaps it's not the way to go. But then I met Tom. And Tom sort of convinced me that tapestry was the way to go. So thank you, Tom. Even though, again, Katrien might feel different. But I would also like to say thank you to Tom's team. A lot of people are and were involved in setting up the exhibition and, of course, this wonderful event. And I think, basically, San Francisco should be grateful to Tom and Tom's team for organizing this exhibition and organizing this event. It's marvelous, and it's nice to see that also the West Coast will be converted, right? Great. And then finally, I would like to thank Krista Thurman, who unfortunately passed away a couple of months ago already. Time flies. And Krista is another, very important tapestry scholar working at the Art Institute of Chicago. She did a lot of nice things for tapestry in the Midwest. She did a lot of nice things for me, and I'm really sorry that she passed away. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the archives or the libraries where you did your research for the presentation?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. So I spent a lot of time in Brussels in the National Archives, but also in the city archives. Spent quite some time in Portuguese National Archives, but that was really a headache because, fortunately, most of these documents were written in French, so that's okay. Vienna, bits and pieces of data I found in Vienna in the National Archives, and then, strangely, in Milan. This is how it goes, right? When the diplomats leave their post and they take with them the archive, right? Then it is kept or it gets lost in the city where they went to. So it was a bit of a puzzle. But it was really fun, actually, to go through all the materials because you find a little bit, it's like making a puzzle without the image, right? Because you don't have anything. So it starts with one single word, throne, and you say, throne? What is it? What's happening? And so you get all these little bits and pieces of information, and then you start to put them on a timeline, you start to think about what it actually means. And again, it's really important. I was so pleased with Lizzie's presentation when she said grote patronen, kleine patronen, because sometimes in literature, all these different nuances are lost. And it's really important to do this microscopic research and to really think about what is that word? What does that word mean in this sentence? And why on earth did they use this word? It's because they wanted to convince somebody else. And so sometimes you get the idea and also attributions to, like the re-edition of the Conquest of Tunis, which we saw, right? That was rewoven for Charles VI in the beginning of the 18th century. And then it was said in the documents after a design by Titian. It was not Titian. And possibly, very possibly, the people in Brussels really realized that they were actually lying. But that could have been a way to persuade Charles VI to commission a new series. So, yeah, great fun archival research. Oh.
Hi, thanks. If I was understanding you correctly, you're basically saying this was the end or near the end of the most productive period for tapestry in Brussels, right? Mm-hmm. When did it, just displaying my ignorance, when was the ascent? How long did that period last when they were so valued and so productive?
Well, that's upstairs, basically. It's a 16th century. I hate to admit it because I'm a 17th century and 18th century scholar, but the most beautiful tapestries, Brussels tapestries, were definitely woven in the 16th century. So that's another reason why it's so great to have the Pavia tapestries here in San Francisco, absolutely. But in the 17th century, they produced a lot of tapestries. It's not that, but it's completely different aesthetics, and there are many reasons why. But anyway, 16th century is just, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that great talk. As someone who's also interested in what art historians can do with things that don't exist anymore, I'm curious if you could say a little more about if you found anything that suggested why this information still exists. Is there any sort of aesthetic concern about preserving information for posterity, or should we be thinking early modern accountants who wanted to get paid?
Yeah, I think nobody in the 17th century or in the 18th century did something for eternity. And especially these tapestry producers, they just wanted to make sure that, right, they were not thinking about the museum as such. I think some of the patrons and that's a completely different story. But in the end, the businessmen, they just simply wanted to produce things, they wanted to sell things, they wanted to make money, they wanted to make profit. And what they wrote down was, to make sure that everything, that there was a written record that people could actually. So it was not written for us, which makes it even more difficult sometimes to interpret what's happening in the document because.
Maybe.
All right, thank you so much. And just an update, we'll have one more paper today. So stay tuned, I'll introduce that speaker, and then we'll have Q&A, and I guess we'll make it into a group Q&A. And then stay tuned right at the end for some just reminders about tomorrow's program at the Legion of Honor. So our next speaker is Rudy Joost Behrens, and Dr. Behrens is a curator at the RKD, the Netherlands Institute for Art History in The Hague, specializing in the socioeconomic context of early modern artists in the Netherlands. From 2016 to 2022, he contributed to Project Cornelia, a digital art history initiative led by a certain Cohen, Brostens, who we just heard from, at the University of Leuven. So we're seeing some continuity in tapestry lineages here. And currently, Dr. Behrens is involved in various projects focused on European tapestries, including just a small project to catalog all the tapestries in Dutch public collections. So, and in 2024, he published the book version of his dissertation, Painters and Communities in 17th Century Brussels, A Social History of Art. So welcome, Dr. Behrens.
Thank you, Jeff, for this kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to also express my gratitude to the organizers of this historic gathering for inviting me. It is truly an honor to speak among such distinguished tapestry scholars, whose work has been a profound source of inspiration to me over the years. The paper I am presenting stems from the research on tapestries in the Dutch Republic I began nearly a decade ago as a student of Koen Brostens at the University of Leuven, and which I continue today as a researcher at the RKD Netherlands Institute of Art History in The Hague. Specifically, I will be discussing the art and politics of renting tapestries. Although the practice of renting tapestries was already mentioned briefly by the Dutch textile historian Gertruda van IJsselstein in her inventory work from the 1930s, it has largely been overlooked in subsequent scholarship. My first encounter with the practice occurred while I was examining the accounts of the city of The Hague in search of references to tapestries. Expecting to find mentions of new commissions or payments for purchased works, I was surprised to come across an entry noting that a certain Joost van Koppenol had been compensated for the rental of 2 rooms of tapestries during the visit of the Queen of Great Britain. This unexpected finding piqued my interest, and as I delved deeper into the archive, I learned that the Queen in question was none other than Henrietta Maria of France, Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Furthermore, I uncovered that the 2 rooms provided by Koppenol were merely a small part of the grand display of tapestries rented to embellish the Queen's visit to the Dutch Republic, which spanned from 1642 to 1643. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I will build on these findings to explore the practice of renting tapestries during this visit, breaking it down into 3 parts. First, I will set the stage with the historic context of Henrietta Maria's visits to the Dutch Republic. Second, I will reconstruct the visit itself with a particular focus on the role of tapestries. And finally, I will broaden the discussion to examine whether the renting of tapestries was a unique feature of this event or part of a broader, more common practice in the Dutch Republic at the time. All right, let's begin with some historical context. When the Dutch Republic welcomed Henrietta Maria in 1642, it was still a relatively young state, striving to assert its place among the powerful monarchies and empires of Europe. The 7 united provinces that made up the Republic had declared their independence from the Spanish crown nearly 80 years earlier, but their sovereignty remained far from secure. The 80 Years' War with Spain was still ongoing, and it remained uncertain whether, and in what form, the Republic would be able to continue to exist. Despite this ongoing war causing significant political tension within the Republic, it also spurred remarkable innovations in agriculture, finance, and maritime trade, quickly transforming the young state into an economic powerhouse. A key factor in this growth was the influx of migrants, primarily Flemish refugees fleeing the Spanish-controlled regions in the south. These migrants brought with them valuable skills, capital, and networks, further fueling the Republic's progress. Among these migrants were hundreds of tapestry workers from cities such as Antwerp, Brussels, and Oudenaarde. They were welcomed with open arms in the Republic, where the local governments of Amsterdam, Delft, and Gouda, among others, were keen to see the labor and capital-intensive industry settle within their city walls. Initially, these governments actively supported the tapestry industry, investing heavily in new series. They were eager to help their newly settled artists establish themselves, while simultaneously using their work to showcase their newfound prosperity and growing sense of national identity and pride. For example, the states of Zeeland, in the southwest of the Republic, commissioned the newly arrived De Maagd family, refugees from Brussels, to weave an extensive series of tapestries celebrating their victories over Spain. As the years passed, however, the cities and provinces of the Republic showed diminishing interest in expensive tapestries, and by the time of Henrietta Maria's visit, they had not commissioned new series for decades. Nevertheless, the tapestry industry continued to thrive, largely thanks to the royal ambitions of one man, Frederik Hendrik, the Prince of Orange. With his noble origins and powerful roles as stadtholder and commander-in-chief of the Dutch state's army and navy, he was the most important figure in the Republic, and he knew it. So, as he achieved victory after victory and accumulated more and more wealth, he increasingly sought to mirror the grandeur of foreign monarchs. While the rest of the Republic watched with suspicion, Frederik Hendrik established a more ceremonial court culture in his hometown of The Hague, commissioned the construction of several palaces and gardens across the country, and, as mentioned, amassed a remarkable collection of tapestries. His royal aspirations were particularly evident in the 1630s, when he commissioned the recreation of a lost series of tapestries depicting his family's genealogy after Bernard van Orley. He later even expanded this series with new pieces that prominently featured himself, his father, and his brothers. And this brings me back to Henrietta Maria, because as the Republic's prominence in international trade and politics grew, Frederik Hendrik's court increasingly attracted the attention of foreign rulers. So much so that in 1641, with the backing of the States General, Frederik Hendrik succeeded in arranging the marriage of his 14-year-old eldest son William to Mary Stuart, the 9-year-old eldest daughter of King Charles I of England and Henrietta Maria. This union was a masterstroke for Frederik Hendrik and the Republic at large, aimed at countering the growing threat of closer ties between England and Spain, while also elevating the Prince of Orange further up the mobile ladder. For Henrietta Maria and her husband, the motives behind the marriage were quite different. Due to Henrietta Maria's Catholic background, they had long been at odds with the English Parliament. They saw an alliance with a Protestant state as a way to ease these tensions, while securing a powerful ally in case the conflict escalated. They found reassurance in the fact that their daughter, still a minor, was legally required to remain in England until her 12th birthday, at which point she could decide whether or not to proceed with the marriage. However, as tensions in England rose sharply in early 1642, Henrietta Maria and her daughter were forced to formalize the marriage ahead of schedule and depart for the Dutch Republic without delay. And this brings me to the second part of my talk, because despite the unexpected timing of Henrietta Maria's visit, Frederik Hendrik and the Republic swiftly mobilized to ensure that the Queen and the Princess, the wife of their future stadtholder, received a reception befitting their stature. On the 10th of March 1642, Henrietta Maria, Mary Stuart, and an entourage of no fewer than 380 people landed in Hellevoetsluis. The renowned Dutch admiral Maarten Tromp had escorted the party abroad several warships, a distinguished service for which he was later knighted by Henrietta Maria's husband Charles I. Upon their arrival, the Queen and her daughter were greeted by an official delegation from the States General. For them, her visit must have marked a significant moment, as she became the first reigning royal to set foot in the Republic, making her also the first to explicitly recognize its sovereignty. The next day, on the 11th, accompanied by the States delegation, the royal party traveled to The Hague, where Frederik Hendrik personally welcomed them. No expense or effort was spared in organizing a festive reception. As the Dutch diplomat Liewe van Eidsema later noted, paraphrasing, a magnificent ballet was performed in honor of the Queen, prompting the consistory of The Hague to file a formal complaint with His Highness, Frederik Hendrik. They criticized the extravagance of the event, singling out his opulent lined mantle and suggesting it could have been made with less material. Be that as it may, Frederik Hendrik extended his utmost hospitality to Henrietta Maria and his new daughter-in-law by providing them with accommodations in a wing of the so-called Oude Hof, better known today as the Noordeinde Palace. This wing served as the Queen's residence for the duration of her visit, and from there she embarked on several journeys across the country. Her first stop, of course, was Amsterdam, the most powerful city in the Republic at the time and the loudest critic of Frederik Hendrik's royal ambitions. For Amsterdam, the visit presented a perfect opportunity to showcase its newly acquired prominence, both at home and abroad, demonstrating that it could host and entertain royal guests on an equal footing with any European court or aspiring monarch. So, employing the age-old and internationally recognized language of ceremony, the city organized a joyous entry that spent no less than 3 days. Naturally, tapestries, long regarded as the quintessential art form of aristocracy, were an essential part of the spectacle. But unlike Frederik Hendrik or their royal guests, Amsterdam did not have a collection of its own. So, to address this, the city turned to the stock of local tapestry producer Joris Nouwings, the son of a Flemish migrant who, among other things, produced tapestries based on designs by Karel van Mander the Younger. In total, Amsterdam paid Nouwings the staggering sum of 2,474 guilders, an amount more than 16 times the average annual income at the time. The city's accounts meticulously detail how many tapestries were rented and their specific uses. Unsurprisingly, the largest share was used to transform the Queen and Princess's residence into a space of unparalleled splendor, with every wall draped from floor to ceiling in luxurious tapestries. Frederik Hendrik and his son, who, as per custom, stayed in a separate building, also enjoyed equally lavish accommodations, fully adorned with a woven medium. Beyond these residences, additional pieces were rented to provide dramatic backdrops for the many theatrical performances staged across the city during the visit. Unfortunately, the city's accounts do not specify the subjects of the rented tapestries. The only detail provided is for 5 pieces in one of the rooms of Henrietta Maria's residence, describing as featuring animals. Beyond this small note, the content of the tapestries remains a mystery. Even the prints of the theaters constructed for the occasion failed to shed light on this. The curtains in every depiction remain firmly closed. After her visit to Amsterdam, Henrietta Maria continued her journey to other key cities, including Haarlem, Leiden, and Gouda. Although these visits typically lasted no more than a day, the city spared no expense in welcoming their royal guests, while also highlighting their own prominence within and beyond the Republic. Lavish meals were served, and most relevant to our story, each city rented tapestries to mark the occasion. Haarlem rented tapestries from tapestry producers in Delft and The Hague, spending 380 guilders for just 4.5 days of use. In Leiden, the residence hosting the royal party was adorned with tapestries, specifically, as records note, to treat the noblemen staying there. And in Gouda, the city hall was decorated with tapestries, both inside and out. Once again, there is no record describing the depictions on the rented tapestries. However, I suspected one of the rooms in Gouda was adorned with the verdure tapestries featuring birds and animals that still hang at the city hall today. Interestingly, this series was purchased by the city from local tapestry producer David Ruffelaar just weeks after the Queen's visit, on the strict condition, and I quote, that the pieces will not be lent to anyone. The remainder of Henrietta Maria's visits was seemingly spent in The Hague, where she occupied herself pawning the English crown jewels to raise funds for the civil war that had now fully erupted between her husband and Parliament in England. By February of the following year, 1643, she concluded that there was little reason to stay any longer and decided to return home, leaving her daughter behind at the foreign court. She set sail from the beach of Scheveningen, and it was for this occasion the 2 rooms of tapestries mentioned in my introduction were rented from Joost van Koppenol. These pieces were hung in the house of the Schout of Scheveningen, where the Queen stayed while awaiting her departure. And that was not all, because to top it off, at the request of Admiral Tromp, who once again had the honor of escorting the royal party, tapestries were also provided to adorn the Queen's cabin aboard his ship. And this time, I even know what was depicted on them, the story of Antony and Cleopatra, a theme that was highly popular at the time. But given that Joost van Koppenol was the brother-in-law of the previously mentioned Joris Nouwings, it is very likely these tapestries are based on the design of Karel van Mander the Younger, who is known to have created a series on this subject. And with the departure of the Queen, I have arrived at the third and final part of my talk. For was the mass renting of tapestries a unique occurrence tied to Henrietta Maria's visit, or was it a more common practice of the time? While more research is needed to fully answer this question, I am personally convinced that renting tapestries was, in fact, quite common. In preparing this talk, I consistently came across new archival documents and contemporary accounts that suggest almost every international or ceremonial event in the Dutch Republic was decorated with rented tapestries. For instance, in 1608, the city of Middelburg paid a local tapestry dealer Vincent Segers to rent a tapestry for the meals they hosted for the French and English ambassadors. A year later, during the negotiation of the 12 Years' Truce, the States Generals rented tapestries to decorate the accommodations of all foreign delegates in The Hague. Tapestries also featured prominently a few years later in 1638, when Maria de Medici, the exiled mother of the French king, visited Amsterdam. The Dutch poet and eyewitness Caspar van Baarle described how dozens of ships gathered to welcome the distinguished guest, including a large vessel of the Dutch West India Company, elegantly draped with tapestries in honor of the occasion. Later, in 1675, the States General rented a house for the negotiations of the Peace of Nijmegen, explicitly requesting that the tapestries already hanging in the house remain in place. And finally, in 1695, the rooms of the French ambassadors negotiating the Peace of Rijswijk were entirely adorned with tapestries rented from the Coppens brothers of Delft. Remarkably, these tapestries are visible in one of the detailed prints that Jan van Vianen made to capture the negotiation progress. And with that, I would like to end. By reconstructing Henrietta Maria's visit to the Dutch Republic, I hope to have shown how rented tapestries played a crucial role in the diplomatic fabric of the young state. As this allegory, created in the Republic in 1702 to depict the political situation of the time, makes extra clear, the woven medium was regarded as a quintessential part of monarchies. This made tapestries the ideal art form for prominent figures like Frederik Hendrik and cities like Amsterdam, not only to match the status and grandeur of foreign courts, but also to showcase their newfound wealth and power. By renting tapestries, the Republic and its cities could relatively cheaply demonstrate their ability to compete with monarchies and empires, earning a place in the ceremonially laden political landscape of Europe. And of course, and I will end with this, a convenient bonus was that these mobile works of art could be easily transported and displayed whether a foreign guest unexpectedly arrived and needed a suitably decorated and isolated room. Thank you.
So now we have time for questions. Thank you for that talk, Joost, and I'm sure there's lots of questions because that was so interesting. So any?
Just the two of them.
Just the two of them. We can let our morning speakers relax, I think.
Yeah.
But I saw there's some hands, yeah. Okay.
Thank you for such a fascinating and in-depth summary of that period for tapestries. Did other people also create tapestries for rent? And how in heaven's name did they afford to be able to build something on spec? Create something on spec. Did they have to start out wealthy? Did they have wealthy patrons who started them?
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
I think in the beginning I thanked you. But how did other countries also have this renting process? and how would the creator of the tapestries afford to create such large tapestries before anybody was renting them? Did they know they had a customer ahead of time who wanted XYZ? And did they themselves decide what was going to be depicted on the tapestry?
Thank you. It's a really good question. Regarding other countries, I'm not sure. I found a reference to one renting of tapestries in Leiden that suggested it was from Brussels, actually. But I have to still go to the archive and check if that's actually true. And for the tapestries on spec, a lot of the tapestry producers in the Dutch Republic produced their tapestries for the market. So they had shops in Amsterdam, for example. The tapestry producer Alexander Baert had a shop in the city center where he could sell his tapestries on spec. And the rest of the Netherlands was the same. So these producers, they had these tapestries, and to be honest, these tapestries were lower quality than the ones made in Brussels or the ones made in Paris. And they just had them laying around, so they could easily rent them out, then receive them back and sell them. So for them, it was just double profit.
Yeah, and also perhaps just to give you an idea about the size or the importance of the tapestry market. So in Antwerp, first half of the 16th century, you had the Antwerp Tapissierspand. So basically, pand means building. That was a huge building that was completely dedicated to the display and trade in Flemish tapestries. And just to give you an idea about the size of this building, well, it had different levels, but it equals 17, so 17 tennis courts. So that was Antwerp alone. And so, of course, not all tapestries shown there are Pavia quality, different qualities, but these were wealthy entrepreneurs who said, yes, of course, we're going to do things on spec, because at that point, they are ready, and when we have a patron, when we have a buyer, it is quid pro quo immediately. This was the quality. We agree that we pay so many guilders per L, right? This was the quality, and they will only be shipped. You only get them if you pay us immediately. Yeah, because if you invest in cartoons, right, you need 3 editions before the investment in cartoons starts to pay off. So the first thing producers did when they commissioned new cartoons, they immediately started to weave editions. Not necessarily complete editions, not necessarily each and every scene, but they just went on, because then they could sell them immediately.
And you see that reflected in the iconography, of course. So it's just very popular themes or generic landscapes like the one I showed in Gouda.
There's a question.
Yes, hello. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I've got a question. Mr. Brosens, you mentioned that, and I think it's probably true for both of you, when you're doing archival research, you're sifting among a lot of things to find what you want. In the course of that, have you ever, or maybe you can give some examples of different areas that has taken you in other than what you were actually looking for, and if that developed into anything?
Well, that's basically my career.
Thank you.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, yes.
I wasn't polite. That was just a joke, of course. No, but you're actually. It is really difficult, and that's why when we did the project Cornelia, you always have to be careful when you do archival research, because it's basically biased throughout, right? And what we try to do, and that's why we needed computer science, what we try to do with Project Cornelia is to simply harvest data, right? because I know that a lot of people go to archives, read a lot of interesting things, sort of forget about it or don't realize it is important because they're so focused on finding that single thing. So basically, the throne ensembles, that's just something that happened. I wasn't doing any research on the throne ensembles. I was doing research on quite different things, actually. But so I got these bits and pieces, and then in the end I decided, yeah, perhaps they can become a story. So, yeah. Jos, I don't know if you...
It's the same for me. With these, the renting of tapestries, I wasn't looking for cities renting tapestries. I was looking for cities buying cushion covers, actually. So when I found this, I just start, you notice it, and you start to look if is this common, is this something that only happened once, and then you certainly stumble upon a whole new area that you can search for in the archive. So it's just, it's always fun. You always discover new things.
There's someone up here. Yes.
I was wondering, it could be irrelevant, but did the tulip mania in the 1630s and the burst of the tulip bubble and speculation, and a lot of the aristocracy and middle classes went broke, did that affect at all any of this?
That's a really good question, and I don't think I can answer this because a lot of the private persons, so the rich people that bought these tulip balls, we don't have any accounts from them. So we don't have their bookkeeping. So we don't know if they bought tapestries. For cities and provinces, it's much easier because they all have their account books that are kept with the cities. But for private persons, it's really hard to tell. But of course, the overspending on tulips made the Protestants quite anxious about spending on anything. And of course they spent a lot of money, but it was always, like you saw with the mantle, you could spend it, but don't show it.
There's a question here.
Thank you. Two fantastic papers, really very, very interesting. I have a follow-up for Koen. Well, I have many questions, but I'll limit myself to one. That was so engaging, seeing how Cobenzl just keeps on pushing and ignoring all the signs to drop it, because there's obviously zero interest. But I thought it's really interesting at the end where you're showing that not even the weavers in Brussels wanted to do this. So what do you think his motivation was? The economy, yeah, but it feels very personal.
I think it was very personal. I think Cobenzl wanted to leave a legacy. And I think he felt that as even though he was called plenipotentiary, basically he was a puppet of Taruka and the Empress. And I think he felt it was his duty to try and at least do something that would make him famous, so to speak, and that also would help the Brussels industry. But by then the Brussels industry was already in a different... And part of the story I didn't tell is that so before Cobenzl became the minister, his predecessor, Botta Adorno, also tried to convince the Empress that tapestry was the way to go. And that was the same thing. It just kept on going. And I think by then, all these Brussels tapestry producers said, okay, no, the House of Habsburg, that's a lost cause. Yeah.
So up there, yes.
Hi, thanks. I actually want to ask
ask a little bit more about these throne ensembles. So forgive me the kind of multi-partness of this question. But I was curious how often we see like a new ensemble appear. You know, is it the kind of thing that happens at the inauguration of every ruler, or does a change happen more often? And when a new ensemble, you know, is made, is it entirely from a new complete design, or is it the kind of thing where you're pulling together, you know, compiling different pieces that have, you know, different kinds of significance or histories? And in the last part of that is we're, you know, thinking about the move from tapestries to the textile one that we saw with the Empress. Were there textiles incorporated into those kind of more 16th, 17th century throne ensembles, you know, with the tapestries as well that, you know, kind of take over to become a part of it. So kind of, yes, all of that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I think I forgot most of your questions already, but, but it was interesting because I was simply listening to, yes, these are interesting questions, not necessarily capable of answering them. But yeah, so pragmatism, I think that's really important. If we study tapestry, we are usually focusing on the exceptional, like the Pavia Tapestries, of course, but even then, we have re-editions of the Pavia Tapestries. And I think it's pretty clear that the project for the Empress was actually some sort of revisiting the John V ensemble. I don't think that perhaps Coecke had ambitions, but clearly in Brussels they didn't feel that it was worth investing a lot of time and energy. When a new ensemble was made is also a very good question. For John V, it was basically the crown. He already had a lot of tapestries, and he felt, okay, now I need an ensemble. For the Empress, she was already an Empress when Coecke tried to. So I don't think it's necessarily related to one historic event, which does not mean that it could never have been related to an historic event, but it takes time, right? It takes time. So if your father dies and you become the new king, right? That happens overnight, and commissioning a new, so it's always going to be then a bit too late, so to speak. But no, every now and then they made special commissions for a special occasion, obviously. Yeah. And then the final part of your question was the textiles, and that I didn't really. So you're asking if the throne ensembles had only tapestry or also other other textile techniques that were part of this ensemble.
Yes, I was just. Is this on? Is it on? Yeah. I was just curious about the move from tapestry to textile, and if other textiles. I'm working on lace right now, so I'm thinking a lot about lace. Okay. Right. So were lace or other different textiles incorporated into the kind of more traditional throne backdrop of tapestries, or is it just tapestries, and we don't see different types of textiles coming until later into the 18th century?
I think, well, the one or the ones we still have, it's only tapestry. I'm also looking at Tom because he also, but what we don't have are curtains, because we sometimes see that that the canopy or that the throne could be closed with curtains. So these could be, were probably different texts. Madame Tom, perhaps?
I think it also rather depended where the commission was coming from. If you were Charles V with access to the Brussels workshops, or Louis XIV with access to the Gobelin, you could commission your tapestry makers to make you armorials. If you were Henry VIII trying to get tapestries from Brussels, they were not going to weave Henry VIII's armorials in Brussels because Henry and Charles were essentially enemies. So the Henrician court, for example, shifted to embroidered. I mean, they had extraordinary, elaborate, embroidered throne canopies. So that's where, when you read the inventories, that's where you see the richness. And a factor that perhaps also is worth drawing attention to and maybe we'll hear more about this from Helen tomorrow, is the quasi-liturgical value of these canopies. In the king's absence, the courtiers paid obeisance to the canopies and the ceremonial beds as if the king was there or the queen was there. So they had a kind of quasi-liturgical presence, and which gradually dissipates during the 18th century. But I think we're going to hear from Helen about the sort of almost liturgical presence of textiles tomorrow, correct? I know Charissa is waiting to speak.
Thank you. It's a question for Koen, and it's a very simple one. In the throne ensemble for John V, did you see if there were metallic threads? You tantalizingly had a document fil d'argent.
Absolutely. So they were using gold threads, but of course these are just threads that are being wrapped. And that was part of the contract. So that was part of the contract. But then there was a whole discussion, and that was part of the thing I showed, that the Brussels producers said, we also included silver thread, even though that was not part of the contract or of the original contract, but we felt that the design needed it. So then at that point, it becomes the producer and the group of weavers overruling, so to speak, the designer. So yes, they had gold and silver thread, which made it even more difficult than to get the money from the Portuguese king, because then they said, but it's not our fault that you have included silver thread. So
we have time for 2 more questions.
Earlier this week, or last week, my wife and I spent a couple of days at, of all places, Bratislava in Slovakia. And we came across a set of tapestries in the bishop's palace that were made for King Charles. And they'd been hidden behind paneling for well over 100 years, and they were in marvelous shape. And they were created in England and woven in England. And nobody has mentioned anything about any tapestry industry in England, and I'm just curious as to was there a tapestry industry there of any magnitude? And these tapestries were woven with silver thread of all things, and so I'm just curious as to the English aspect of this.
You're very lucky to have seen those tapestries. So they're after designs that were made for Charles I. And Tom and I have both worked on the workshop that was set up in 1619 in London with Flemish weavers, many of whom fled the Low Countries at the same time that they were going to the northern Netherlands. Many weavers also came to England. So there was a workshop until the early 18th century, which made many people say the best tapestries in Europe during a short period of 20 years under Charles I. So yeah, there'll be more tomorrow on the Mortlake workshop. And it's a fantastic set, but that set, nobody knows its early history, and it is an amazing story that it was hidden behind a wall. So yeah, thank you for mentioning it.
And so while the microphone travels to the final question, my wife sent me a beating heart.
And Tom, do you want to conclude? Is there one last question? Is there one last question? No, no more questions.
I have a quick question for Rudy.
Oh, Lizzie gets the final question.
Sorry, just because it was such a fascinating talk, Rudy. And I really loved the way you drew attention to this kind of double standard and the censure that Frederick Hendrik gets for spending too much money and for coveting and collecting tapestries. And yet then we see Amsterdam spending obscene amounts of money just renting them. So was there any muttering about this waste of civic funds renting tapestries, or is it the fact that they were renting and not commissioning that made it okay?
I haven't found any, but I can imagine that there was someone somewhere, well, knowing the Dutch people, you know, I can imagine that there was someone somewhere complaining about the spending on these joyous entries. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers for a fabulous set of presentations. Really, really fascinating. Can we have another round of applause for them? And thank you to you, the audience, for being here physically. Thank you to those who are joining us online. And a reminder that we will resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, not here. We will be at the Legion of Honor at 10 o'clock in the Gun Theatre. And while today the papers have primarily been on the Low Countries, tomorrow we're going to France and England and Italy, and looking at production and designs primarily from those locations. So tomorrow promises to be an equally stimulating and exciting day. I hope as many of you will rejoin us as possible. And again, thank you so much. The Pavia Tapestry show, of course, is open this afternoon. It closes on Sunday, so you have another hour and 40 minutes this afternoon. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.